She thought she had just lost her job. But the billionaire's next words made her heart stop, because the name she accidentally called him awakened a love, a pain, and a mystery that no one was ready to face. Happy evening, my beautiful Proudly family. Welcome back to Proudly Black Stories. Your love and support mean the world to us. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, which country are you watching from? What time is it in your city right now? If you're new here, subscribe and officially become part of our Proudly family. Now, let's begin today's unforgettable story. The coffee cup shattered against the marble floor the moment the word left her mouth. Here's your order, baby. Amara Whitfield froze mid-sentence, her hand still extended, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she thought the entire cafe could hear it. 63 floors above the streets of Atlanta, in the private executive lounge of Callaway Enterprises, one of the most powerful men in the country sat in stunned silence. Xavier Callaway did not move. He did not blink. For 3 long seconds, the only sound in the room was the soft hiss of the espresso machine behind the counter and the frantic thudding of Amara's own pulse in her ears. Then, slowly, deliberately, Xavier Callaway set down the folder he'd been reading, folded his hands on the table, and looked up at her with an expression she could not read. "What did you just call me?" Amara's stomach dropped through the floor. She had worked in this executive lounge for 8 months. 8 months of pouring coffee for men who barely looked at her, who tossed $100 tips like she was invisible furniture that happened to serve espresso. 8 months of keeping her head down, her voice soft, her presence small, because that was how you survived in a place like this when you were the help. And in one exhausted, distracted moment, after a double shift, after 4 hours of sleep, after a morning spent calming her little sister down over the phone about their mother's medical bills, she had slipped. The word had come out on autopilot, the way it might slip out to a stranger at a gas station, a habit born from years of working retail jobs where baby, honey, and sweetheart were just filler words, harmless verbal tics that meant nothing. But this was not a gas station. This was Xavier Callaway, billionaire, CEO, the most talked about, most feared, and most desired man in the entire Southeast corporate world. A man whose face had been on the cover of Forbes twice this year alone. A man who, according to every rumor that swirled through this building, had not smiled in public since his fiancée's funeral 3 years ago. I'm so sorry, sir, Amara stammered, dropping to her knees to gather the shattered porcelain, her fingers trembling. "I didn't mean, it just slipped out. I've had a long morning. I promise it won't happen again, please. I need this job. Stop! Stop!" The single word cut through her rambling apology like a blade. Amara froze, a piece of broken cup still in her hand, blood beginning to well from a small cut on her fingertip where the porcelain had sliced her skin. She hadn't even felt it happen. Xavier rose from his chair. 6'3" of tailored charcoal suit, broad shoulders, a jaw carved from stone, and eyes so dark they looked almost black in the low afternoon light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. He crossed the room in 4 unhurried strides and crouched down in front of her, taking her injured hand gently into his own. Amara's breath caught. "You're bleeding," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice she had never heard directed at her before. Not annoyance, not the clipped, distracted tone he used with his assistants. Something almost tender. "It's nothing, sir, Xavier." She blinked up at him. "Excuse me, my name Xavier." "Not sir, not Mr. Callaway, not when you're bleeding on my floor because I startled you." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded white handkerchief, pressing it carefully against her cut finger. "And for the record, nobody has called me baby in 3 years." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them expected. Amara's throat tightened. She knew the story. Everyone in Atlanta's business circles knew the story, whispered in elevators and break rooms like a legend. Xavier Callaway had been engaged once to a woman named Vanessa Price, a rising architect with a smile that used to light up magazine covers. 3 years ago, a drunk driver had taken her life on a rain-soaked highway 2 weeks before their wedding. Xavier had shut down after that, sold off his father's company's sentimental holdings, buried himself in work, and became the cold, untouchable figure the tabloids now called the Ice King of Atlanta. And she had just called him baby. "I really am sorry," Amara whispered, pulling her hand back gently, though something in her didn't want to. "I'll clean this up and I'll finish my shift, and if you want to report this to management, I understand completely." Xavier studied her for a long moment, really studied her. Not the way men in this building usually looked at her, sliding their eyes over her uniform and dismissing her before she'd even spoken. He looked at her face, her tired eyes, the faint tremor in her hands that had nothing to do with fear of losing her job and everything to do with exhaustion that went bone deep. "What's your name?" he asked. Amara Whitfield, Amara." He said it slowly, like he was testing the shape of it in his mouth. "How long have you worked here?" 8 months, sir, Xavier," she corrected herself quickly. heat rushing to her cheeks. "And in 8 months, has anyone in this building ever asked you how you're doing? Not performance-wise, not shift-wise, how you are doing?" Amara opened her mouth, then closed it again. The honest answer was no, not once. She was furniture to these people. Competent, quiet, efficient furniture. "I didn't think so," Xavier said, reading the silence correctly. He stood, extending his hand to help her up. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, and the warmth of his palm against hers sent an unexpected current up her arm. "Xavier, I really do need to get back to work. There are 3 more orders waiting and my supervisor. Take the rest of the day off." "Paid what?" "No, I can't. I need every hour I have." She stopped herself before the words bills, my mother's chemotherapy, my sister's tuition could spill out. That was not information you handed to billionaires. That was not information you handed to anyone. But Xavier's eyes narrowed slightly, sharp and perceptive in a way that made her nervous. "You have what?" "Nothing. It doesn't matter, Amara." His voice dropped lower, and something about the way he said her name made her knees weak in a way she absolutely did not have time for. "I own this building. I own the company that owns this cafe. If I say you take the day off paid, that is not a suggestion. That is an order from your employer, and you will follow it." Despite herself, despite the exhaustion and the humiliation still burning in her chest, Amara felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. That's a very billionaire thing to say. For the first time in 3 years, the first time anyone in that building had witnessed, Xavier Calloway smiled. It transformed his entire face. The cold, unreachable CEO from the magazine covers vanished, replaced by something boyish and warm and devastatingly handsome. "Noted," he said. "I'll work on my delivery." She should have walked away right then. She told herself that 100 times over the following days. She should have taken the paid day off, gone home, checked on her mother, and never thought about Xavier Calloway again, except as an embarrassing story she'd tell her best friend Denise over wine someday. "Remember that time I called my billionaire boss baby and nearly got fired?" But 3 days later, a black town car was waiting outside her apartment building when her shift ended. The driver, an older man with kind eyes named Mr. Reeves, rolled down the window. "Ms. Whitfield? Mr. Calloway would like to see you. He said to tell you it's about your mother's medical bills." Amara's blood ran cold. "How does he know about my mother?" Mr. Reeves only smiled apologetically. "That, ma'am, is above my pay grade. But I promise you it's good news," against every instinct screaming at her to refuse. To protect the fragile privacy she'd built around her family struggles, Amara got into the car. She had no idea that this single decision, this one moment of trust in a stranger who happened to be the most powerful man in Atlanta, was about to unravel secrets buried for 3 years. Secrets about Vanessa's death, secrets about a rival family determined to destroy Xavier Calloway's empire, and secrets about why, the moment she had called him baby, something long frozen inside Xavier's heart had finally begun, impossibly, to thaw. The car pulled up in front of a penthouse she had never seen before, security guards nodding them through gates she didn't know existed. And standing at the top of the marble steps, waiting for her with an expression somewhere between hope and fear, was Xavier Calloway. "There's something you need to know," he said the moment she stepped out of the car, his voice tight with an emotion she couldn't place. "About your mother, about her doctor, and about why I've been looking for a woman named Amara Whitfield for the last 3 years without even knowing it was you." Amara's entire world tilted on its axis. "What are you talking about?" Xavier's jaw clenched, his dark eyes glistening with something raw and unguarded. "Vanessa," he said quietly. "My fiancée. Before she died, she wrote your name in her journal. She said if anything ever happened to her, I needed to find a woman named Amara. She said," his voice cracked, "she said you would save my life." Amara stood frozen on the marble steps, the evening wind pulling at her uniform jacket, waiting for Xavier's words to make sense. "They didn't. They couldn't. That's not possible," she said slowly. "I never met your fiancé. I've never even set foot in this building before 3 days ago." "I know." Xavier's hands were trembling, actually trembling, this man who ran board meetings with the steadiness of a surgeon. "I've spent 3 years thinking it was impossible too. I hired investigators. I searched hospital records, university records, every Amara in the state of Georgia. I never found you because," he exhaled hard, "because 8 months ago you didn't even work in this city yet. Vanessa wrote that name 2 years before you moved here." Amara's skin prickled. "That doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense. Come inside, please." She should have said no. Every practical, cautious part of her screamed that this was insane, that she was a coffee girl standing on a billionaire's doorstep being told a dead woman had somehow known her name before she'd ever set foot in Atlanta. But there was something in Xavier's eyes, something desperate and honest, that made refusal impossible. She followed him inside. The penthouse was breathtaking, but Amara barely registered the floor-to-ceiling views of the city skyline, the modern art, the quiet grandeur of it all. Xavier led her to a study lined with bookshelves, where a single leather journal sat open on a glass desk, its pages yellowed slightly at the edges. "This was Vanessa's," he said, voice low. "I couldn't open it for 2 years. When I finally did 6 months ago, I found this." He turned the journal toward her. Amara's breath caught as she read the looping, elegant handwriting. "If something happens to me, Xavier needs to find a woman named Amara. I don't know her last name. I don't know where she lives. I only know she has kind eyes and she will come into his life when he needs saving most. Please, if you're reading this and I'm gone, don't let him become the man his father wanted him to be. Don't let him turn to ice. Find her. Trust her. Love her if you can." Amara's hands went cold. "This is—" She swallowed hard. "This is impossible. How would she know my name? I didn't even know your fiancé existed until 3 days ago when the other baristas told me the rumors." "I don't know," Xavier admitted. "I've asked myself that question every day for 6 months. Vanessa believed in things I never did. Premonitions, dreams, the idea that people could sense things before they happened. I used to tease her about it." His voice broke slightly. "I never got the chance to tell her I was wrong." Amara sat down slowly in the chair across from the desk, her legs unable to hold her up any longer. "Xavier, I think there might be a simpler explanation. Maybe there's another Amara. Maybe it's a coincidence. I thought that too. Until you called me baby in that lounge, and I felt something crack open in my chest that has been sealed shut since the day I buried her." He crouched in front of her chair, the way he had crouched beside her on the floor of the cafe 3 days ago, and this time when he took her hand, she didn't pull away. "I'm not asking you to believe in fate, Amara. I'm asking you to let me help your mother. I'm asking you to let me get to know you. Whatever this is, coincidence, destiny, or just 2 lonely people who needed each other, I don't want to walk away from it without finding out." Tears burned behind Amara's eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. Nobody had spoken to her like this in years. Not since her father died, not since the medical bills started stacking up, not since she'd become the sole provider for her mother's cancer treatment and her younger sister's college tuition, carrying the weight of her entire family on shoulders that were beginning to buckle. "My mother has stage 2 breast cancer," she heard herself say, the confession spilling out before she could stop it. "The insurance covers maybe 60% of her treatment. I'm working 2 jobs and I still can't cover the rest. My sister wants to drop out of Spelman to help, and I won't let her, so I just keep drowning quietly and pretending I'm fine." Xavier's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with something fierce and protective. "Give me your mother's information, tonight. Whatever she needs, the best oncologist in the state, experimental treatments, private care. It's done, no conditions, no strings. I can't accept that, I don't even know you. Then let's fix that." A ghost of that rare smile returned to his face. "Have dinner with me, not because you owe me anything, not because of some journal entry from a woman who might have been wrong. Just have dinner with me, Amara Whitfield, and let me be a person for once instead of a headline." Something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight for years, loosened just slightly. "Okay," she whispered. "Dinner." Neither of them noticed the black sedan parked across the street, or the man inside it photographing every window of the penthouse with a long-lens camera, a man employed by Callaway Enterprises board vice-chair, Marcus Sinclair, who had been waiting 3 years for Xavier Callaway to show even the faintest crack in his armor. He had finally found it, and he intended to use it. Dinner turned into 3 hours of conversation that felt like 30 minutes. Xavier ordered in from a restaurant Amara couldn't have afforded in 5 years of saving. But what struck her most wasn't the food. It was how normal he seemed once the tie came off and the walls came down. He asked about her sister, about her mother's favorite flowers, about the community college photography class she'd had to drop when the bills got too heavy. He listened, really listened, in a way that made her feel, for the first time in years, like a whole person instead of a machine built for survival. "Why did you become a barista?" he asked at one point, swirling wine he barely touched. "Your resume, forgive me, I had HR pull it after the incident, shows 2 years of a business degree from Georgia State." Amara's smile faded slightly. "My father got sick when I was a sophomore. I had to withdraw to help. I always meant to go back. You still could, with what money, Xavier? Some of us don't have a family company waiting for us." She hadn't meant it to come out sharp, but he didn't flinch. He nodded slowly, absorbing it, respecting it. "You're right, I'm sorry. I forget sometimes what privilege insulates a person from." It was such a simple acknowledgement, but it disarmed her completely. Most wealthy men she'd encountered, and working in that lounge, she'd encountered plenty, either flaunted their privilege or pretended it didn't exist. Xavier just owned it, quietly. Honestly, by the time Mr. Reeves drove her home that night, Amara's head was spinning with something dangerously close to hope. She didn't notice the envelope waiting under her apartment door until she stepped inside. No return address, no stamp. Hand-delivered. Inside was a single photograph, Her, laughing, sitting across from Xavier at his penthouse table, taken through the window with devastating clarity, and a single typed line beneath it. Stay away from Xavier Calloway, or your mother's hospital finds out exactly who's been paying her bills. And why? Amara's blood turned to ice. She had never told anyone that Xavier had already quietly paid off her mother's outstanding balance that very afternoon, hours before dinner, without telling her. A fact she'd only discovered when her mother called in confused tears asking why the hospital said her account showed a zero balance. Someone was watching. Someone already knew everything, and whoever it was had just made it terrifyingly clear. This fragile, impossible connection between her and Xavier Calloway had a price, and someone intended to make her pay it. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Ask him about Vanessa's accident. Ask him what really happened on that highway. Then decide if you still want to have dinner with him again. Amara's hands shook as she stared at the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs. Was Vanessa's death really an accident? And what exactly was Xavier Calloway hiding? Amara didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her bed with the photograph in her lap, reading the threatening message over and over until the words blurred together. By 4 in the morning, exhaustion finally won, but her dreams were fractured. Flashes of headlights on wet asphalt, a woman's voice she'd never heard whispering her name. She woke to 11 missed calls from an unknown number and 1 voicemail from her sister Kayla asking, in a voice too calm to be anything but panicked, why a strange man had come by their mother's house asking questions about the Calloway situation. Amara's stomach dropped. She called Xavier before she could think better of it. He answered on the first ring. Amara? It's 6 in the morning. Is everything all right? Someone came to my mother's house, she said, her voice shaking despite her attempt to keep it steady. Someone's watching me, watching us. I got a photo last night of me and you at dinner, with a threat attached, silence on the line, then quietly, dangerously, send it to me. Now. 20 minutes later, Xavier was standing in her cramped apartment doorway, still in the sweatpants and t-shirt he'd clearly thrown on in a rush, his hair uncharacteristically disheveled, his expression thunderous as he studied the photograph and the message on her phone. Marcus, he muttered under his breath. Who's Marcus? Marcus Sinclair, my father's old business partner's son, vice chair of the board. He's wanted my seat since the day my father died and left it to me instead of him. Xavier's jaw was tight, a muscle ticking dangerously near his temple. He's the only person who would benefit from destroying my reputation right now. The board vote for renewing my CEO contract is in 6 weeks, Xavier. Amara's voice trembled. The message said to ask you about Vanessa's accident. It said it wasn't really an accident. Is that true? Something shuttered behind Xavier's eyes. A door slamming closed on a room he clearly didn't want her to see. For a long moment he said nothing, staring down at the photograph in his hands like it had reopened a wound he'd spent 3 years trying to stitch shut. Sit down, he finally said. There's something I should have told you before any of this started. Amara's legs felt weak as she lowered herself onto her second-hand couch, her heart pounding with dread. Xavier remained standing, his back to her, staring out the small window at the grey Atlanta morning. The night Vanessa died, he began, his voice low and controlled in a way that felt like it was costing him everything to maintain. We'd had an argument, a bad one. She'd found out that my father, before he died, had been embezzling from a client's trust fund, and she wanted me to report it publicly. I wanted to handle it quietly, protect the company, protect my father's legacy even though he was already gone. She called me a coward. She left angry, driving to her sister's house in the rain. His hands curled into fists at his sides. The official report says a drunk driver ran a red light and hit her car. That part is true, but 2 days before she died, she told her best friend she thought someone from Sinclair's side of the family had been following her, watching her. She thought Marcus somehow knew about the embezzlement investigation she'd convinced me to quietly reopen. Amara's blood went cold. You think Marcus had something to do with her death? I don't have proof. I never had proof. The driver who hit her was a 22-year-old kid with a blood alcohol level over the limit. A real person, a real drunk driving accident, confirmed by police, by cameras, by witnesses. But 6 months after her funeral, I discovered that Kid had received an anonymous cash deposit of $50,000 into his account 4 days before the accident. Enough to buy a new car, enough to disappear the moment he made bail. Xavier finally turned to face her, and the raw grief and rage in his eyes stole the breath from her lungs. I've spent 3 years trying to prove Marcus paid that driver to be on that road that night. I've never been able to prove it. And now he's threatening you to keep me quiet, keep me controlled, keep me exactly where he wants me until that board vote. Amara's mind reeled, horror and heartbreak crashing over her in waves. Xavier, I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry for me. Be careful. Because if Marcus is willing to pay off a drunk driver to eliminate an obstacle, I don't know what he's willing to do to protect himself now that you know his name. Xavier crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking both her hands in his touch fierce and protective. I should let you walk away. I should tell you to forget this, forget me. Go back to your life before I dragged you into this danger. But God help me, Amara, I don't want to. Vanessa believed you were sent to save me from becoming a man who feels nothing. And these past 3 days, for the first time in 3 years, I've felt everything. Tears slid down Amara's cheeks before she could stop them. I'm scared, Xavier. I know, so am I. His thumb brushed gently across her knuckles. But I promise you this, whatever Marcus is planning, whatever comes next, I will not let anything happen to you or your family. I'll put security on your mother's house today. A sharp knock at the door interrupted him. Amara froze. I'm not expecting anyone. Xavier rose immediately, positioning himself between her and the door, every trace of vulnerability vanishing beneath the hard, controlled mask of a man used to confronting danger head-on. Who is it? He called out. A muffled voice answered from the hallway. Delivery for Amara Whitfield, certified mail, signature required. Xavier's eyes narrowed with suspicion, but he opened the door carefully, his large frame blocking Amara from view. A courier in a plain uniform held out an envelope and a clipboard. Xavier signed for it himself, his eyes never leaving the courier's face until the man disappeared back down the stairwell. He closed the door, locked it, and turned the envelope over in his hands. There was no return address, just Amara's full name, typed in the same font as the threatening text message. Don't open it, Amara whispered, fear coiling tight in her chest, but Xavier was already tearing it open, his expression darkening with every passing second as he read the single page inside. What is it? Amara demanded, rising on shaking legs. Xavier, what does it say? He looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw genuine fear flicker across the billionaire's normally composed face. It's a paternity test, he said quietly, for a child named Elijah Sinclair, Marcus's son. His hand trembled slightly as he turned the paper toward her. The test results say I'm the father. Amara stared at the paper in Xavier's hand, certain she'd misheard him. That's not possible. You just told me you found her journal 6 months ago. You barely know me, let alone, how could there be a child that's supposedly yours with Marcus's last name? Because it's not possible. Xavier's voice had gone flat, dangerously calm, the voice of a man doing everything in his power not to shatter something with his bare hands. I've never touched a woman named anything associated with Marcus Sinclair's family. This is fabricated. It has to be. Then why send it to me? Xavier's dark eyes lifted to hers, and understanding dawned in both their faces at the same moment. Because he wants you to doubt me, Xavier said slowly. He wants you to believe I'm a liar, a cheat, a man capable of denying his own child. If you believe that, you walk away from me. And if you walk away from me, you go back to being exactly what he needs you to be, Amara finished. Cold, alone, distracted, easy to manipulate before the board vote. Yes. Amara sank back down onto the couch, her mind racing. Everything about this felt calculated, cruel, designed with surgical precision to exploit the one fragile, hopeful thing that had bloomed between them in the space of a few short days. And the horrifying part was, it was working. Doubt had already crept its cold fingers around her heart, whispering, what if it's true? What if you don't really know this man at all? I need to see the test, she said. The lab, the name on it. Xavier handed it to her without hesitation, which, she realized, told her more than any words could. A guilty man would have hidden it, destroyed it, made excuses. He simply gave it to her, willing to let her scrutinize every detail. Amara studied the document. Something snagged at the edge of her attention. A familiar name at the bottom, printed small beneath the lab's letterhead. Dr. Renata Cole, she read aloud. This is signed by Dr. Renata Cole. Do you know her? She's the head oncologist at Grady Memorial. The same doctor treating my mother. Amara's pulse quickened. Xavier, this lab, Sterling Diagnostics. It's the same lab my mother's insurance company uses for all her blood work. I recognize the letterhead because I've stared at enough of her medical bills to memorize it. Xavier went very still. Marcus doesn't just have access to fabricate a paternity test. He has access to the exact medical network treating your mother. His jaw hardened, which means he could tamper with her records too, falsify a diagnosis, delay her treatment, or worse. Amara's blood ran cold at the implication. He wouldn't. He couldn't possibly. I don't know what Marcus Sinclair is capable of anymore, Xavier said grimly. 3 years ago, I would have told you he was a spoiled, entitled disappointment, riding his father's coattails. Now I think he's dangerous, and he's just shown us he's willing to weaponize your family's healthcare to control this situation. Amara's phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. Did you see the results? Ask him how many other secrets he's kept from you. Then check your mother's chart at Grady Memorial. Room 412. Ask for the file update from this morning. Xavier. Amara's hands shook as she showed him the screen. He wants me to go to the hospital right now, then we go together. Xavier was already reaching for his keys, his phone pressed to his ear before Amara could respond, barking orders to someone named Diane about pulling security footage and getting his personal legal team on standby. Whatever this is, whatever he's done, we face it together. I'm not letting you walk into whatever trap he's built alone. The drive to Grady Memorial took 11 minutes that felt like 11 hours. Amara's mind spun through worst-case scenarios. A falsified diagnosis, a cancelled treatment plan, some cruel manipulation designed to devastate her right when she was most vulnerable. Xavier's hand found hers on the console between them, steady and warm despite the storm brewing in his eyes, and she clung to it like an anchor in rising water. They found Dr. Cole in the hallway outside room 412, reviewing a chart with a confused expression on her face. "Mrs. Whitfield," Dr. Cole said, looking up in surprise. "I was actually about to call you. There's been an irregularity in your mother's file." "What kind of irregularity?" Amara's voice came out barely above a whisper. Dr. Cole hesitated, glancing between Amara and the imposing man beside her before continuing. "Someone accessed your mother's records early this morning using administrative credentials that don't belong to anyone on her actual care team. They didn't change anything in the chart itself, but they downloaded her complete file, medical history, insurance information, even the payment confirmation showing her balance was cleared yesterday by a private donor." Xavier's expression darkened to something lethal. "Do you know who accessed it?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "It is still tracing the login, but—" Dr. Cole lowered her voice. "The access came from an IP address registered to Sinclair Vance Capital Group." Amara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Marcus hadn't just threatened them. He hadn't just sent a fabricated paternity test to sow doubt. He had physically infiltrated her mother's private medical records, armed now with every piece of information he'd need to destroy their family financially, medically, emotionally, whenever he chose to pull the trigger. "He's not just trying to scare us anymore," Xavier said quietly, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "He's building a file, ammunition. For what? I don't know yet, but we need to move faster than he is." Dr. Cole's pager buzzed, and she excused herself with an apologetic glance, leaving Amara and Xavier alone in the sterile hallway. Amara turned to him, tears burning in her eyes. Not from fear this time, but from something fiercer. Anger, protectiveness, a determination she hadn't felt in years. "I want to fight back," she said. "I don't know how, I don't know what resources I have compared to him, but I refuse to let this man use my mother's cancer as a weapon." Something shifted in Xavier's expression, pride, admiration, and something warmer underneath it all. "Then we fight together. I have resources you can't imagine, Amara. Lawyers, private investigators, forensic accountants who've been quietly building a case against Marcus for years, just waiting for enough evidence to move. What we've been missing is a trigger, a reason to finally go to war." His hand cupped her face, gentle despite the storm in his eyes. "I think Marcus just gave us one." He leaned down, and for a moment Amara thought he might kiss her right there in the hospital corridor, the air between them thick with 3 days' worth of impossible connection and now shared danger. But before their lips could meet, Xavier's phone erupted with a call. He answered, and his face went white as chalk. "Say that again," he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. Amara watched as something in him seemed to collapse and harden simultaneously. "What is it?" she demanded. "Xavier, what's wrong?" He lowered the phone slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers with an expression of pure devastation. "That was my head of security," he said. "Marcus just filed an emergency board motion. He's citing evidence of, and I quote, reckless personal conduct unbecoming of a sitting CEO, using photos of you and me together as Exhibit A. He's forcing an emergency vote." Xavier's hands curled into fists. "Tonight, in 4 hours. He's trying to remove me as CEO before we can even build a defense." Amara's heart stopped. Can he do that? He shouldn't be able to, but he's clearly been planning this for longer than we realized. Xavier's jaw clenched, the muscle jumping violently beneath his skin. "And there's something else. My security chief says Marcus's assistant was overheard on a call this morning saying, and again I quote, 'Onk Xavier's out, the real Vanessa file finally comes out too.'" Amara's blood turned to ice. "What does that mean?" Xavier's eyes, when they met hers, held a devastation so profound it stole the air from her lungs. "It means," he said slowly, "that Marcus knows something about Vanessa's death that I don't. Something he's been sitting on for 3 years. And he's finally ready to use it." The 4 hours before the emergency board vote passed in a blur of frantic motion. Xavier's penthouse transformed into a war room, lawyers arriving with briefcases full of contracts, his head of security, a sharp-eyed woman named Yolanda Briggs, pulling up encrypted files on a laptop, and Xavier himself pacing the length of the room like a caged animal, barking instructions into 2 phones at once. Amara sat at the edge of it all, feeling simultaneously essential and utterly useless. This was a world of corporate warfare she had no experience navigating. Board bylaws, fiduciary duty clauses, emergency motion procedures. But when Yolanda mentioned the words Sinclair Vance Capital Group for the third time, something in the back of Amara's mind clicked into place. "Wait," she said suddenly, cutting through the noise. "Sinclair Vance. I've heard that name before." Every head in the room turned toward her. "Where?" Xavier asked, crossing the room in 3 quick strides. "My mother's file, the insurance paperwork. Sterling Diagnostics, the lab that ran the fake paternity test. It's owned by a parent company. I remember because the reimbursement forms were so confusing, I had to call 3 times to understand the billing structure." Amara's mind raced, trying to piece together fragments of tedious paperwork she'd read a dozen times while fighting with insurance adjusters. Sterling Diagnostics is a subsidiary of Vance Medical Holdings. Yolanda's fingers flew across her keyboard. 30 seconds later, her face went sharp with vindication. She's right. Vance Medical Holdings was acquired 18 months ago by Sinclair Vance Capital Group. Marcus doesn't just have access to falsify records, Xavier. He owns the lab. He's been sitting on infrastructure to manufacture exactly this kind of fraud for over a year. Xavier's expression turned lethal. "Get that acquisition paperwork. Every filing, every disclosure. If Marcus used company resources or insider knowledge from his board position to acquire a medical holdings company specifically to weaponize patient data, that's not just unethical, that's criminal. That's grounds for immediate removal, not me. There's no time to build that case before the vote tonight." One of the lawyers, a tired-looking man named Preston, interjected. "The board motion is airtight procedurally. We can challenge it, but we can't stop it in 4 hours." "Then we don't stop it," Xavier said, an idea visibly sharpening behind his eyes. "We beat him at his own game. If Marcus wants to make this personal, wants to drag Amara's photo and my private life in front of the board as evidence of misconduct, then we hand the board something he never expected." "Which is?" Xavier turned to Amara, and something in his gaze made her stomach flip. "The truth, all of it. Vanessa's journal, the anonymous deposit to the driver who killed her, the fabricated paternity test, the illegal access to your mother's medical records. We stop playing defense and we go on offense tonight in that boardroom in front of every single person Marcus was counting on to vote against me." "That's insane," Preston said. "You'd be airing 3 years of grief and suspicion in a public forum with zero preparation." "I don't have the luxury of preparation," Xavier said. "I have 4 hours and a woman standing in this room who has already shown more courage in 3 days than most of that board has shown in their entire careers." His eyes found Amara's, warm and fierce all at once. "Will you stand with me tonight? I won't pretend it isn't a risk. Marcus will try to twist your presence, question your motives, humiliate you in front of some of the most powerful people in Atlanta. I need you to know exactly what you'd be walking into before I ask this of you." Amara's heart pounded, fear and resolve warring in her chest. 3 days ago she'd been an invisible barista, terrified of losing her job over a slip of the tongue. Now she was being asked to stand in a boardroom and help take down a man who'd already proven he was willing to destroy her family to win. But she thought of her mother, fragile and exhausted from chemotherapy, unaware that a predator had been circling her medical file. She thought of Vanessa's handwriting in that journal. "Don't let him become the man his father wanted him to be. Don't let him turn to ice." She thought of the warmth in Xavier's eyes when he'd knelt beside her on that cafe floor, before any of them knew how deep this danger ran. "I'm not going to hide," Amara said, lifting her chin. "Marcus already made me part of this the moment he broke into my mother's hospital records. I want to look him in the eye when his own lies collapse around him." Something fierce and proud blazed in Xavier's expression. "Then let's go to war." The Callaway Enterprises boardroom occupied the top floor of the building, a cavernous glass-walled space overlooking the entire Atlanta skyline, already glowing gold with sunset by the time they arrived. 14 board members sat around the long mahogany table, murmuring among themselves, several throwing openly curious glances at Amara as she walked in at Xavier's side, dressed in a simple black dress Yolanda had procured for her in under an hour. At the head of the table sat Marcus Sinclair, younger than Amara expected, mid-30s, with the kind of polished, camera-ready handsomeness that masked something reptilian underneath. He smiled when he saw them enter, slow and satisfied, like a man watching his trap close exactly as planned. "Xavier," Marcus said smoothly, rising to greet him with false warmth. "And this must be the barista. How quaint, Marcus." Xavier's voice was ice, controlled fury beneath every syllable. "Let's not waste the board's time with pleasantries. You called this emergency session. Say what you came to say." Marcus's smile widened. He gestured for the room to quiet, and with theatrical timing, pulled up a presentation on the boardroom's massive screen, photos of Xavier and Amara at his penthouse, the two of them holding hands in Grady Memorial's hallway, a photo taken through a long lens of Amara crying in her apartment. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board, I've called this session because I have serious concerns about our CEO's judgment," Marcus began, his tone smooth and rehearsed. "In the span of 1 week, Mr. Calloway has become entangled in an inappropriate relationship with a company employee, an entanglement that has already resulted in erratic decision-making, unauthorized emotional distraction, and now allegations that he's fathered an illegitimate child he refuses to acknowledge. Gasps rippled around the table. Amara felt her cheeks burn but kept her spine straight, refusing to look away as 14 sets of eyes assessed her like she was some scandal to be dissected. I move for the immediate removal of Xia Calloway as Chief Executive Officer. Marcus continued, citing conduct unbecoming of a company leader and clear evidence of impaired judgment that threatens shareholder value. The room erupted in murmured debate. Marcus remained standing, smug satisfaction radiating from every polished inch of him, clearly expecting Xavier to stammer, deny, or crumble under the weight of public humiliation. Instead, Xavier rose slowly, unbuttoning his suit jacket with deliberate calm, and Amara watched the Ice King of Atlanta return, not the cold, distant version the tabloids described, but something far more dangerous, a man in complete lethal control. "Thank you, Marcus, for that presentation," Xavier said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "Now let me offer the board a presentation of my own." He nodded to Yolanda, who stepped forward and connected her laptop to the screen. The photos of Amara vanished, replaced by a scanned document, a bank transfer record, dated 4 days before Vanessa's fatal accident. "This is a $50,000 wire transfer into the account of Devon Marsh, the driver who killed my fiancée, Vanessa Price, 3 years ago," Xavier said, his voice steady despite the visible tightening of his jaw. "The transfer originated from a shell account traced back to Sinclair Vance Capital Group, Marcus's company." The room went utterly silent. "That's a fabrication," Marcus snapped, his composure cracking for the first time. "You have no proof that—" "I have bank records, Marcus. Forensic accountants have been tracing this transaction for 18 months, waiting for enough corroborating evidence to present it publicly." Xavier's eyes were merciless. "And thanks to a woman you tried to threaten into silence this week, we found the missing piece. You didn't just pay off a drunk driver to eliminate an obstacle 3 years ago. You've spent the last year illegally acquiring medical holding companies to manufacture false records, including a fabricated paternity test sent to intimidate Amara Whitfield, and unauthorized access into the private medical file of her mother, a cancer patient at Grady Memorial." Yolanda pulled up the IT security log showing the illegal access, the acquisition paperwork for Sterling Diagnostics, the timeline connecting every fraudulent thread back to Marcus's private accounts. Marcus's face had gone the color of ash. "This is a coordinated smear campaign. This board should recognize character assassination when they—" Enough. An older board member, a silver-haired woman named Constance Whitmore, who Amara would later learn was Calloway Enterprises' longest-serving director, rose from her seat, her expression thunderous. "Marcus Sinclair, you've just been formally accused of fraud, corporate espionage, and potential involvement in a fatal accident that killed this company's future architect-in-law. I move for your immediate removal from this board, effective tonight, pending full criminal investigation." The room dissolved into chaos, board members shouting over one another, Marcus's protests growing increasingly desperate, security quietly summoned to the room. Amara watched it all unfold like a fever dream, 3 years of buried grief and corporate corruption finally collapsing under the weight of its own lies. Through the chaos, Marcus's eyes found hers, wild with fury and something colder underneath. The look of a cornered animal who still had one card left to play. "You think this is over?" he hissed, loud enough for only her and Xavier to hear as security moved toward him. "You think exposing the driver's payment proves anything about that night? I never said I paid him to kill her, Xavier. I paid him to follow her. Someone else gave the order for what happened after." Xavier went rigid beside her. "What are you talking about?" Marcus's smile turned vicious even as security gripped his arms. "Ask your father's old attorney, Xavier. Ask him who really controlled that shell account before I inherited it. Ask him what your father knew about Vanessa's accident before he died of his own convenient heart attack 6 months later." The room fell into stunned, horrified silence as security dragged Marcus toward the elevator, his laughter echoing coldly off the glass walls. Amara turned to Xavier, whose face had drained of all color, his hands trembling at his sides for the first time since she'd met him. "Xavier," she whispered, "what does he mean about your father?" Xavier's dark eyes, when they finally met hers, were filled with a devastation so profound it stole her breath. "My father died of a heart attack 6 months after Vanessa's funeral," he said slowly, his voice hollow. "I always thought it was grief, stress, the embezzlement investigation eating away at him." He swallowed hard. "But if Marcus is telling the truth, if my father was involved in whatever happened to Vanessa, then his death might not have been natural either." The boardroom around them had erupted into fresh chaos, board members debating emergency motions, security escorting a still shouting Marcus toward the elevators, phones already buzzing with reporters somehow alerted to the unfolding scandal. But all Amara could focus on was the broken, haunted look in Xavier's eyes, a man who had just watched the ground beneath his entire understanding of his father, his fiancée's death, and his own family's legacy crumble into something far darker than he'd ever imagined. "We need to find that attorney," Amara said quietly, taking his trembling hand in both of hers. "Tonight, before Marcus's people can reach him first." Xavier looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, something fierce and grateful blazing behind the devastation. "3 days ago I didn't know you existed," he said quietly. "Now I don't know how I'd face any of this without you." Neither of them noticed Constance Whitmore watching them from across the chaotic room, her expression unreadable, or the way she quietly pulled out her phone and typed a single text message to a number saved only as RP. A message that read simply, "It's happening," just like she said it would. Time to tell them the rest. Xavier's father's former attorney, a man named Harold Denning, lived in a modest colonial home in a quiet suburb of Marietta, the kind of unassuming address that seemed impossibly disconnected from the corporate warfare Amara had witnessed just hours earlier. Xavier had called ahead, his voice tight with barely restrained urgency, and Denning had agreed to see them despite the late hour, nearly 10 o'clock at night. The old man who opened the door looked like he'd aged a decade in the few seconds since answering the phone. His hands trembled as he ushered them into a cluttered study lined with law books and yellowed family photographs. "I wondered when this day would come," Denning said, sinking into a worn leather chair, not bothering to offer either of them a seat. "I've been waiting 3 years for you to ask me the right questions, Xavier. I just didn't have the courage to volunteer the answers." "Then start now," Xavier said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "What did my father know about Vanessa's accident?" Denning's eyes closed briefly, as though gathering strength for a confession he'd been dreading. "Your father didn't order what happened to Vanessa. I want you to understand that first. But he knew about it beforehand, and he did nothing to stop it." Amara felt Xavier go rigid beside her. "Explain," Xavier said, the single word carved from ice. 6 months before Vanessa died, she came to your father with evidence of the embezzlement scheme, the one she eventually convinced you to help her expose. She didn't just find proof against your father, Xavier. She found proof that Marcus's father, Richard Sinclair, was involved too, that the two of them had been quietly siphoning funds from client trusts for nearly a decade, splitting the profits, covering for each other. Denning's hands shook as he reached for a glass of water on the side table. "Vanessa threatened to go public, not just to embarrass the company, to protect the clients whose retirement funds were being drained. Your father panicked. He met with Richard Sinclair to discuss how to handle the threat. And," Xavier's voice had dropped to something dangerous, "and Richard Sinclair suggested the situation be neutralized. Your father swears, and I believed him, God help me. I believed him, that he thought Richard meant a legal solution, an NDA, a payout. He never imagined Richard would arrange for her car to be run off a highway by a driver he'd paid to be in the right place at the right time." Denning's voice cracked. "By the time your father realized what had actually happened, it was already done. Vanessa was already dead, and he was too much of a coward, too protective of the company, too terrified of prison, to come forward." Amara watched the color drain entirely from Xavier's face, his hands curling into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. "You knew this," Xavier said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You knew this for 3 years and you said nothing. Your father made me swear on his deathbed," Denning said, tears finally spilling down his weathered cheeks. "He said if the truth came out, it would destroy the company, destroy your legacy, destroy everything he'd spent his life building for you. He begged me to protect you from it. I've hated myself every single day since." "You protected a murderer," Xavier said, his voice shaking with a fury Amara had never witnessed in him before. "You let the man responsible for Vanessa's death walk free for 3 years while I tortured myself wondering if there was something I could have done differently." "Richard Sinclair is dead, Xavier," Denning said quietly. "He died 8 months ago, heart failure officially. But I've always suspected Marcus finally learned what his father had done and decided the world, and his own political ambitions, were better served with Richard gone and buried before the truth could surface." The implications crashed over Amara like a physical blow. Marcus killed his own father to keep him quiet. "I have no proof," Denning said, "only suspicion." But Marcus inherited controlling interest in Sinclair Vance Capital the same month his father died, moved unusually fast to consolidate power, and has spent every day since positioning himself to take Xavier's company the same way his father once tried to take control of the family trusts he was embezzling from. Denning looked up at Xavier with something like desperate hope. "Whatever you decide to do with this information, know that I am prepared to testify to all of it. I have documentation, records of my conversations with your father. I should have come forward years ago. I'm ready now. Xavier stood in silence for a long moment, staring at nothing, the weight of 3 years of grief, guilt, and unanswered questions finally crystallizing into a truth more devastating than anything he'd imagined. Amara reached for his hand, and this time he gripped it back like a lifeline. I need everything you have, Xavier finally said, his voice hoarse. Every record, every conversation, every piece of paper trail connecting my father, Richard Sinclair, and Vanessa's death. I'm taking this to the district attorney tomorrow morning. Xavier. Denning's voice was heavy with regret. Understand what this means. If this comes out publicly, your father's involvement, however passive, in a cover-up that led to a murder, it will destroy his reputation, posthumously, permanently. Everything he built could be remembered as nothing but the legacy of a coward and an accomplice. Xavier's jaw tightened, but his voice when he spoke carried a conviction that made Amara's chest ache with pride. My father made his choice 3 years ago. He chose the company's reputation over justice for the woman I loved. I won't make the same mistake. Vanessa deserves the truth, no matter what it costs. They left Denning's house just after midnight, the old attorney promising to have his documentation ready by morning, tears of relief and shame mixing on his weathered face as he watched them go. In the car, Amara studied Xavier's profile in the dim glow of passing streetlights, watching the muscles in his jaw work as he processed the devastating truth about his father's cowardice and Marcus's likely patricide. Are you okay? She asked softly. No, Xavier admitted, his voice raw. I don't think I will be for a long time. But for the first time in 3 years, I finally understand what happened to her. And somehow, knowing the truth, even a truth this ugly, feels better than 3 years of not knowing. He reached over and took her hand again, bringing it to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles. Vanessa's journal said you would save my life, he said quietly. I used to think that meant something romantic, something simple. But sitting in that room tonight, hearing the truth about my father, about Marcus, about everything I've been running from, I don't think I could have survived hearing any of it alone. You didn't just save me from becoming cold and untouchable, Amara. You gave me the strength to finally face what I've been too afraid to look at for 3 years. Amara's eyes filled with tears, overwhelmed by the weight of everything they'd uncovered in a single devastating night. Xavier. Her phone buzzed, cutting off whatever she'd been about to say. A text from Kayla, her sister, sent just 2 minutes earlier. Amara, where are you? Mum's been trying to call you for an hour. Something's wrong. She says a woman came to her hospital room tonight claiming to be from Vanessa Price's family. She wouldn't leave until Mum agreed to pass along a message. She said to tell you, the real danger was never Marcus. It's someone much closer to Xavier than he realizes. Amara's blood ran cold as she read the message a second time, then a third, her hands trembling around the phone. Xavier. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Someone claiming to be connected to Vanessa's family just visited my mother in the hospital. She left a warning. Xavier's entire body went rigid. What did she say? Amara looked up at him, fear and confusion warring in her chest as she processed words that made no sense, and yet somehow felt like the missing piece of a puzzle neither of them had realized was incomplete. She said the real danger was never Marcus, Amara whispered. She said it's someone much closer to you than you realize. Xavier's face went pale as understanding and dread began to dawn in his eyes. Constance, he breathed. Constance. Amara searched his face, confusion knitting her brow. Constance Whitmore, the board member who moved to remove Marcus tonight. She's been on the board since before I was born, Xavier said slowly, his mind visibly racing backward through years of memory, reassembling old moments into a new, more sinister shape. She was my father's closest confidant, closer than Denning even. If anyone else knew what my father did, what he allowed to happen to Vanessa, it would be her. You think she's involved? I don't know what to think anymore. Xavier scrubbed a hand down his face, exhaustion and dread etched into every line of his expression. But she was the one who called for Marcus's immediate removal tonight. Fast, almost too fast, like she wanted him gone before he could say anything else. Amara's phone buzzed again. Another text from Kayla. The woman left something for you. A photograph. Mum's scared, Amara. She wants you to come now. We need to get to the hospital, Amara said, panic rising in her throat. Xavier was already redirecting Mr. Reeves. His voice clipped with barely controlled urgency as he simultaneously dialed Yolanda, ordering additional security dispatched to Grady Memorial immediately. The drive felt endless, city lights blurring past the windows as Amara's mind spun through impossible possibilities. If Constance Whitmore had orchestrated this, if she'd been the one pulling strings behind Marcus's manipulation, or worse, connected somehow to Vanessa's death, then everything they thought they'd uncovered tonight was only the surface of something far deeper and more dangerous. They found Amara's mother, Loretta, sitting up in her hospital bed, looking small and fragile against the white sheets, but her eyes were sharp with fear when Amara rushed through the door. "Baby, I'm all right," Loretta said quickly, seeing the panic on her daughter's face. "She didn't hurt me, she said things, strange things. What did she look like, Mama?" "Older, elegant, silver hair pulled back tight. She had kind eyes, but something sad about her too, like she was carrying something heavy." Loretta's hand trembled as she reached for the small manila envelope on her bedside table. "She left this, said to give it only to you, and only when you had Xavier Calloway standing beside you." Amara's hands shook as she took the envelope. Xavier stood close behind her, his hand resting protectively at the small of her back, his own breathing tight and controlled. Inside was a single photograph, old, slightly faded, clearly decades old. It showed two young women standing arm in front of what looked like a college building, both laughing at something outside the frame. Amara didn't recognize either face at first. Then her eyes caught the handwritten date scrawled in the corner, 32 years ago. "Xavier," she said slowly, turning the photo toward him. "Do you recognize her?" Xavier's face went ashen as he stared at the image, his hand rising slowly to touch the edge of the photograph like he didn't quite trust his own eyes. "That's my mother," he said, his voice hollow with shock. "She died when I was 4. I barely remember her face except from portraits in the house." His finger moved to the second woman in the photo, younger with familiar sharp cheekbones and unmistakable eyes. "And that's Constance. They were friends. Best friends from the look of it. I never knew that. My father never once mentioned that Constance knew my mother before she died." Behind the photograph, tucked into the envelope, was a folded note in the same elegant handwriting Amara now recognized from Vanessa's journal. Though this note was newer, the ink fresher. "Xavier, I should have told you the truth years ago, but I was afraid of what it would cost both of us. I am not your enemy. I am the only person who has been trying to protect you from Marcus and Richard Sinclair since before you were born. Your mother didn't die of illness, as your father always claimed. Meet me tomorrow at the Ashford Chapel, 9 a.m., and I will finally tell you everything. About your mother, about Vanessa, and about the real reason Richard Sinclair spent 30 years trying to destroy this family. Come alone. Bring Amara. No one else can be trusted." Amara looked up at Xavier, watching the devastating weight of a lifetime of lies settle over his features. A mother whose death had been shrouded in mystery. A fiancé murdered to protect old secrets. A father who chose cowardice over justice, and now, possibly, the only person left alive who could finally explain why. 30 years, Xavier whispered, staring at the note like it might dissolve in his hands. "This has been happening for 30 years, and I never knew any of it." Loretta reached out from her hospital bed, taking her daughter's hand with surprising strength for a woman in the middle of chemotherapy. "Baby, whatever this is, whatever you're walking into tomorrow, you be careful. I didn't survive this diagnosis just to lose my daughter to somebody else's 30-year-old secrets." "I'll be careful, Mama," Amara promised, though her voice wavered with uncertainty she couldn't quite hide. Xavier knelt beside the hospital bed, taking Loretta's other hand gently in his own, his dark eyes solemn. "Mrs. Whitfield, I swear to you, I will protect your daughter with everything I have. I know that promise means little from a stranger who's dragged her into danger within a week of meeting her, but I intend to keep it for as long as I live." Loretta studied him for a long moment, something assessing and maternal in her tired eyes before finally nodding. "You've got kind eyes, son, same as that woman in the photograph." Her gaze flicked to the picture still clutched in Amara's hand. "Vanessa believed you needed my daughter to save you from turning to ice. Maybe it's time somebody believed the same thing about you saving her." Neither Xavier nor Amara noticed, in the emotional weight of the moment, the shadow that passed briefly across the small reinforced window of the hospital room door. A figure watching, then retreating quickly down the hallway before hospital security making rounds could notice them lingering. They didn't sleep that night. Instead, they sat together in Xavier's penthouse study, poring over decades of Calloway family history. Old photographs, business records Xavier had never thought to question, half-remembered childhood memories he was suddenly seeing through an entirely new lens. "I always thought my mother died of a sudden illness," Xavier said quietly around 3 in the morning, staring at a faded photograph of a woman he barely remembered holding him as an infant. "My father never talked about her. I used to think it was grief. Now I wonder if it was guilt." "You don't know that anything happened to her," Amara said gently, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them, given everything they'd already uncovered about the Calloway and Sinclair family's entangled, poisonous history. "I don't know anything anymore," Xavier admitted. 3 years of grief over Vanessa's death, and it turns out that was just the surface of something that's been rotting for 3 decades. He turned to look at her, exhaustion and raw vulnerability etched into every line of his handsome face. "I keep thinking about what Vanessa wrote in her journal, that you'd come into my life when I needed saving most. I used to think that meant emotional healing, Now I wonder if she meant something far more literal, like she knew, somehow, that I'd need someone brave enough to walk into whatever this is with me. Amara reached across the space between them, cupping his face in her hands, feeling the exhaustion and grief radiating from him like heat from a dying fire. I'm not going anywhere, Xavier. Not tomorrow at that chapel, not after, not through whatever comes next. Something happened the moment I called you baby in that cafe. Something I still don't fully understand, but I know I'm not walking away from it now. Xavier's eyes searched hers, dark and vulnerable and hopeful all at once, and this time when he leaned forward, neither of them pulled away. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, years of grief and loneliness meeting weeks of impossible connection in a single aching moment. Then Xavier's hand slid into her hair, deepening the kiss with a desperate tenderness that made Amara's heart ache with the weight of everything they'd both survived to reach this moment. When they finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, breathing unsteady, Xavier whispered against her lips, "Whatever Constance tells us tomorrow, whatever truth we uncover about my mother, about Vanessa, about this family's 30 years of secrets, I need you to know that this right here is real. Not because of some prophecy in a dead woman's journal, because of you, because of who you are." Amara's eyes filled with tears, overwhelmed by emotion she'd been suppressing for years beneath the weight of survival and responsibility. "I need you to know something too," she whispered. "I've spent so many years just trying to keep my family afloat. I forgot what it felt like to hope for something for myself. You've given that back to me, Xavier. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm grateful for that." They held each other through the remaining hours of darkness, neither quite able to sleep, both acutely aware that dawn would bring them to Ashford Chapel and whatever devastating truth Constance Whitmore had been carrying for 30 years. The chapel sat on the outskirts of the city, a small ivy-covered stone building that had clearly once belonged to a larger estate, now surrounded by encroaching suburban development. Constance Whitmore was already waiting when they arrived just before 9, standing beside a weathered gravestone in the small adjoining cemetery, her silver hair catching the pale morning light. "You came," she said, relief evident in her voice as Xavier and Amara approached. "I wasn't certain you would trust me enough. I'm not certain I do," Xavier said honestly. "But I'm here. Start talking." Constance's eyes flicked briefly to the gravestone beside her, and Amara's breath caught as she read the name carved into weathered marble. Diane Calloway, beloved wife and mother, 1968 to 1998. "Your mother wasn't sick, Xavier," Constance said quietly. "She was murdered by the same man who eventually orchestrated Vanessa's death 30 years later, Richard Sinclair." Xavier went completely still. "Why, what could my mother possibly have had to do with Richard Sinclair?" Constance's composed exterior finally cracked, decades of guilt and grief spilling into her voice. "Because your mother discovered what Richard Sinclair and your father were building together before either of them had a chance to profit from it. She threatened to expose the embezzlement scheme when it was still in its infancy, decades before Vanessa found the same evidence and made the same threat." Constance's hands trembled as she reached into her coat pocket, withdrawing an old yellowed letter. "This is her final letter to me, written 3 days before she died. She knew Richard was planning something. She just didn't realize how far he'd go to protect 30 years of stolen fortune." Xavier took the letter with shaking hands, his eyes scanning his mother's handwriting for the first time in his adult life, and then his face went white as paper, his entire body swaying like he'd been struck. "What?" Amara asked urgently. "Xavier, what does it say?" He looked up at her, and at Constance, his voice barely a whisper. "She writes that she was 3 months pregnant when she died, with a second child." His hands trembled violently around the letter. "I have a sibling, one that Richard Sinclair made sure never got the chance to be born." Constance's eyes filled with tears. "That's not entirely accurate, Xavier. I need you to sit down for this next part." "Why?" Xavier demanded, dread thick in his voice. Constance's gaze shifted, slow and deliberate, to Amara. "Because your mother didn't lose that baby, Xavier," Constance said quietly. "I helped her disappear for 6 months before Richard's men caught up with her. The baby survived. I placed her with a loving family myself, changed every record I could to protect her identity, and prayed every single day for 26 years that Richard Sinclair would never discover what I'd done." The world seemed to tilt beneath Amara's feet as understanding dawned in horrifying, impossible clarity. 26 years, Amara whispered. Her own age, precisely. Constance's eyes, wet with 3 decades of guilt and secrecy, finally met hers directly. "Amara Whitfield isn't your birth name," Constance said softly. "Your birth name was Amara Calloway. Xavier isn't just the man Vanessa's journal said would save your family." Her next words shattered everything Amara thought she understood about her own life. "He's your brother." Amara's ears rang. The chapel, the gravestones, Xavier's stricken face, All of it seemed to recede into a distant blur as Constance's words echoed over and over in her mind. "He's your brother." "That's not possible," Amara whispered, stumbling back a step. "My parents, my mother is Loretta Whitfield. My father raised me. I have his eyes, his laugh, You have adoptive parents who loved you enough to never tell you the truth," Constance said gently, though her voice trembled with its own uncertainty now. "I placed you with the Whitfield family myself, Amara. I chose them because I knew them to be good, honest people who—" "Stop!" Xavier's voice cut through the chapel yard like a blade, hoarse and shaking. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken since Constance's revelation, but now his eyes had sharpened into something fierce and disbelieving. "Show me proof, not a letter, not a story. Actual proof." Constance blinked, thrown by the demand. "Xavier, I was there. I held you the day you were born. And I held her." "I don't doubt what you believe," Xavier said, cutting her off, his mind clearly racing now, working the same problem Amara's own panicked heart was struggling to solve. "I doubt what you were told. 3 days ago, someone sent Amara a fabricated paternity test through a lab Marcus secretly owns. Someone with the resources and the motive to plant exactly this kind of devastating lie at exactly this moment, when destroying whatever exists between us would serve him better than any board vote ever could." Constance went very still. "You think Marcus fed me false information? I think Marcus has spent this entire week manufacturing exactly the kind of psychological warfare that would break us apart without a single shot fired," Xavier said, his voice gaining steadiness even as his hands remained visibly unsteady at his sides. "A fake paternity test to make Amara doubt me. A break into her mother's medical records to terrify her, and now delivered through you. Someone with genuine history in my family, someone we'd have no reason not to trust, the single most devastating lie imaginable. One that wouldn't just end this, it would make us feel sick for ever having begun it." Amara's mind reeled, hope and horror tangling together so tightly she could barely breathe. "Constance, is it possible you were wrong or lied to?" Tears filled the older woman's eyes, her carefully composed exterior finally crumbling entirely. "I received a call 4 days ago from a woman claiming to represent the adoption agency I used decades ago off the books to protect Diane's daughter. She said she'd found records confirming the baby I placed had grown up in Atlanta under the name Whitfield. She sent documentation, birth records. I was so desperate to finally make this right after 30 years of silence, I didn't question it as carefully as I should have." Her voice broke. "Oh God, if Xavier's right, I just handed both of you the cruelest weapon Marcus could have asked for." "Where are the documents?" Xavier demanded. "The ones this woman sent you." Constance fumbled in her bag with shaking hands, producing a folder of papers. Xavier snatched them, scanning quickly, his jaw tightening with each page. "These are from Sterling Diagnostics," he said grimly, turning the letterhead toward Amara. "The same lab Marcus owns. The same lab that fabricated the paternity test naming me as the father of Marcus's son." The relief that flooded through Amara was so violent it nearly buckled her knees. Xavier caught her before she could stumble, his arms wrapping around her, both of them shaking with the aftershock of horror narrowly averted. "It's not true," Amara breathed against his chest. "Xavier, it's not true." "I don't fully know that yet," Xavier said carefully, though the desperate hope in his voice matched her own. "But I know enough to say we're not accepting this as fact, based on documents from a lab with a documented history of fraud this week alone." He pulled back to look at her, his thumb brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "We get real DNA testing. Independent lab today, results verified by people with no connection to Marcus, Sterling Diagnostics, or anyone in his orbit. Until then, we don't destroy what's real based on what might be his last, most vicious lie." Constance sank onto the low stone wall bordering the cemetery, her face buried in trembling hands. "I am so sorry. I let my guilt over 30 years of silence make me reckless. I could have destroyed something precious based on a manipulation I should have recognized immediately." "You didn't know," Amara said, finding a strange, unexpected compassion for the woman even amid her own residual shock. "You've spent 30 years carrying guilt over a friend's murder and a child you were forced to give away. Of course you wanted to believe you'd finally found her." "There's still a piece of this that's true, though," Constance said quietly, lifting her head. "Diane was pregnant when she died. I did help hide a baby from Richard Sinclair 30 years ago. That child exists somewhere, Xavier, whether or not it turns out to be Amara. Marcus may have exploited that truth, but he didn't invent it." Xavier's jaw hardened. "Then we find her. Or him. The real sibling Richard Sinclair's violence cost me a lifetime of knowing." He turned to Amara, his hand finding hers, steadying them both. "But first we get you tested today. I won't spend another hour not knowing for certain." The independent lab Xavier chose operated out of a nondescript building 40 minutes outside the city, run by a geneticist Yolanda had vetted personally, with zero connections to Marcus, Sterling Diagnostics, or anyone in Callaway Enterprises' orbit. The wait for expedited results. 6 agonizing hours was the longest of Amara's life, spent pacing the halls of Xavier's penthouse in near silence, both of them too afraid to voice the hope neither could fully suppress. When Xavier's phone finally rang, he answered before the first ring finished, his whole body rigid as he listened to the lab technician on the other end. Amara watched his face, searching for any flicker of devastation or relief, her own heart hammering so hard it hurt. "Say it again," Xavier said quietly into the phone. "Say it slowly." A long pause. Then his eyes closed, and a sound escaped him that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Thank you," he breathed. "Thank you." He lowered the phone and turned to Amara, and the look on his face told her everything before he even spoke the words. "No genetic relation," he said, his voice thick with relief. "Zero shared markers. Whoever falsified those adoption records, whatever Marcus was trying to do to us, it was a lie. All of it. You're not my sister, Amara." The relief that crashed through Amara's body was so overwhelming she barely felt herself moving before she was in his arms, both of them holding on with a desperation born of the worst 24 hours either of them had ever lived through. "I'm so sorry," Xavier murmured into her hair. "I'm so sorry Marcus dragged you into something that vile, that calculated, just to break us." "We're okay," Amara whispered back, though her voice shook with the aftershock of it all. "We're okay, Xavier. We survived his worst move." But even as relief washed through her, a colder thought surfaced beneath it, one she could see mirrored in the sudden tightening of Xavier's expression as he pulled back to look at her. "If it isn't you," Xavier said slowly, "then somewhere out there, Marcus knows exactly who my real sister is, and he's already proven tonight that he's willing to weaponize that knowledge in the cruelest way imaginable." Constance, who had remained quietly in the corner of the room throughout the agonizing wait, rose to her feet, her expression hardening with a resolve Amara hadn't seen in her before. "Then we find her first," Constance said, "before Marcus can use her against you the way he tried to use Amara. I owe your mother that much, Xavier. I owe this family 30 years of silence I intend to finally repay." Xavier nodded, some of the devastation in his eyes hardening into determination. But before anyone could say another word, Yolanda burst through the study doors, her face pale, a tablet clutched in her trembling hand. "Xavier, you need to see this," she said urgently. "It's Marcus. He's giving a press conference, live, right now." She turned the tablet toward them, and Amara's blood ran cold at the image on the screen. Marcus Sinclair, standing before a wall of reporters and cameras, his composure fully restored, a triumphant smile curling across his face. "And it's with a heavy heart that I share this information today," Marcus was saying, his voice dripping with false solemnity. "But the public deserves to know the truth about the man controlling one of Atlanta's most powerful companies. Xavier Calloway isn't just guilty of reckless personal conduct, he's guilty of something far darker, something buried by his own family for 30 years. Amara's stomach dropped as Marcus turned to the assembled cameras, his eyes glinting with vicious satisfaction. "Tonight, I'm releasing evidence that Xavier Calloway's own father orchestrated the murder of his first wife, Diane Calloway. My inheritance, ladies and gentlemen, the truth Xavier has spent his entire life hiding from the public who trusted him to lead this company with integrity." Xavier's face went rigid as stone, watching Marcus twist the truth in real time, weaponizing tragedy for a very different purpose than the one Amara and Xavier had uncovered themselves. "He's lying," Xavier said through gritted teeth. "He's spinning this to make it sound like I orchestrated a cover-up. Not that I've spent the last 24 hours trying to expose one." "That doesn't matter to the cameras," Yolanda said grimly, already typing rapid-fire messages on her phone. "By the time this airs, half of Atlanta will believe you've been hiding a murder for 30 years to protect your own reputation." On the screen, Marcus continued, his voice smooth and practiced, clearly rehearsed for maximum damage. "Sources confirm that Diane Calloway's death was ruled a sudden illness at the time. A convenient story that conveniently avoided scrutiny thanks to the Calloway family's considerable influence over the medical examiner's office in 1998. I have reason to believe Xavier Calloway learned the truth about his mother's murder years ago and chose silence over justice, the same way he's chosen silence and manipulation to control this board and this company ever since." "He's using our own truth against us," Amara said, horror dawning as she watched the calculated brilliance of it. "He's twisting everything we found out this morning and making it sound like you're the one covering it up." "Then we get ahead of it," Xavier said, already moving toward his desk, adrenaline replacing shock with fierce, focused resolve. "Yolanda, get my publicist on the line. We're not hiding from this. We're not spinning it. We tell the truth. The real truth, with Constance's testimony, with Denning's records, with everything we uncovered. We beat him to the story before he can finish rewriting it." Constance stepped forward, her spine straightening with newfound purpose. "I'll go on record, publicly. I should have done it 30 years ago. I won't hide from it now. That could destroy what's left of your reputation too, Xavier warned her. My reputation has survived 30 years of guilt I couldn't speak about, Constance said firmly. It can survive the truth. Within the hour, Xavier's team had arranged an emergency press conference of their own, this one held not in a boardroom but on the front steps of Callaway Enterprises, cameras and reporters gathering rapidly as word spread that Xavier intended to respond directly to Marcus's explosive allegations. Amara stood just off to the side as Xavier approached the podium, Constance beside her, both women watching as he drew a steadying breath before facing the wall of cameras and microphones. 24 hours ago, I learned that my mother, Diane Callaway, was murdered 30 years ago. Not by illness, as I was told my entire life, but by a man named Richard Sinclair, in collaboration to whatever extent with my own father, Xavier began, his voice steady despite the visible strain in every line of his body. I learned this same man was responsible for the death of my fiancée, Vanessa Price, 3 years ago, after she discovered evidence of a decades-long embezzlement scheme he ran alongside my father. I did not learn these truths to protect myself, as Marcus Sinclair just suggested to all of you. I learned them because I refused to stop asking questions that everyone around me, for 30 years, was too afraid to ask. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as Xavier continued, his voice gaining strength with every sentence. Marcus Sinclair is not a whistleblower exposing my family's secrets today. He is a man protecting his own. His father, Richard Sinclair, orchestrated my mother's murder and my fiancée's death to protect stolen fortunes from client trust funds spanning 3 decades. When Marcus discovered what his father had done, he didn't expose it, he inherited it. The money, the power, and quite possibly, given the suspicious circumstances of Richard Sinclair's death 8 months ago, the willingness to silence anyone who threatens to expose the truth. Gasps rippled through the assembled press. Amara watched reporters scribbling furiously, phones already buzzing with alerts as the story began reshaping in real time. I have documentation, Xavier continued, financial records connecting Sinclair Vance Capital to the driver who killed Vanessa Price. Testimony from my father's own attorney confirming what he knew and chose to hide. And a witness, he gestured toward Constance, who stepped forward with quiet, dignified resolve, who has carried the truth about my mother's death for 30 years, afraid of exactly the kind of retaliation Marcus Sinclair has spent this past week demonstrating he's fully capable of. Constance approached the podium, and in a clear, steady voice, she confirmed every detail. Diane Callaway's discovery of the embezzlement scheme, Richard Sinclair's threats, the murder disguised as sudden illness, and 3 decades of silence born from fear rather than complicity. By the time the press conference ended, the narrative Marcus had so carefully constructed lay in ruins, replaced by a far more damning truth about the Sinclair family's 30-year legacy of violence and corruption. Amara felt something like relief settle into her chest as they finally retreated from the cameras, until her phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number, cold dread flooding through her the moment she read it. Impressive performance. But you're still missing the most important piece of this puzzle. Ask Constance who really fathered you, Xavier. Ask her why Richard Sinclair wanted your mother dead so badly. It wasn't just about the embezzlement money. Amara's blood turned to ice as she showed the message to Xavier, watching his face drain of color as he read it. What is he talking about? Xavier asked, turning to Constance, who had gone very still, her earlier composure crumbling into something like dread. Constance, Xavier said again, more urgently, what is he talking about? Constance's eyes filled with tears, decades of buried secrets finally reaching their breaking point. There's one more thing I never told you, she whispered, about your father, about who he really was to Richard Sinclair before any of this began. Xavier's expression darkened with a mixture of exhaustion and dread that Amara recognized all too well after the last 36 hours. Constance, no more secrets, say it. Constance drew a long, shuddering breath, her eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, as though she were staring 30 years into the past, rather than at the 2 people standing before her. Your father and Richard Sinclair weren't just business partners, Xavier, she said slowly. They were half-brothers, same father, different mothers. Your grandfather, Edmund Callaway, had an affair in the early 60s with a young woman named Marguerite Sinclair. Richard was the result. Edmund paid the Sinclair family handsomely to keep the affair quiet, to keep Richard's paternity buried, and to ensure the Callaway name and fortune passed cleanly to his legitimate son, your father. Amara felt Xavier's hand tighten around hers as the weight of this new revelation settled over him. Richard spent his entire life watching your father inherit everything that should have by blood belonged equally to him, Constance continued. The company, the name, the fortune. He grew up in Sinclair Capital's modest offices, building his own empire from nothing, all while your father inherited a legacy Richard believed was rightfully half his. The embezzlement scheme wasn't just about greed, Xavier. It was Richard's way of quietly reclaiming what he believed your grandfather stole from him. And when your mother discovered it and threatened to expose it, Richard didn't just see a threat to his fortune. He saw a threat to the only inheritance he'd ever managed to claim for himself. That still doesn't explain why he'd go after my mother with that kind of violence, Xavier said, his voice hoarse. Embezzlement is a crime, Constance. It's not a reason for murder. Constance's eyes glistened with fresh tears. There's more. Diane didn't just discover the embezzlement, Xavier. She discovered Richard's true paternity in the process, buried in old estate documents she found while auditing your grandfather's original trust structure. She confronted Richard directly, not to blackmail him, but because she believed, foolishly, generously, that if the truth came out, your father might finally do the right thing and share the inheritance Richard had been denied his entire life. She thought she was offering him justice. Constance's voice broke entirely now. Richard didn't see it as justice. He saw a woman who knew the one secret capable of unraveling everything he'd spent decades building in the shadows. He couldn't risk her exposing his connection to the family, not when he'd already begun quietly siphoning funds to build the fortune he felt he was owed, so he made sure she'd never get the chance to speak. The chapel yard fell into heavy silence, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the soft rustle of wind through the ivy-covered walls. Xavier stood motionless, absorbing decades of hidden family history rewriting itself in real time. A secret half-uncle, a stolen inheritance, a murder motivated not just by greed but by a lifetime of resentment over a birthright denied. Marcus knows this, Xavier finally said, understanding dawning cold and clear in his voice. He's known this whole time. That's why he spent his entire life so obsessed with taking my company, my name, everything I have. He doesn't just want power. He believes it's rightfully his. Generational payback for an inheritance his father was denied. Yes, Constance confirmed quietly. And that's why he's willing to kill for it, Amara added, the pieces clicking together with horrifying clarity. His father murdered your mother and Vanessa to protect stolen money. Marcus is doing exactly the same thing to protect what he believes is his birthright. Xavier's jaw hardened, 3 decades of family tragedy crystallizing into fierce, unshakable resolve. Then it ends today. Not with more secrets, not with more silence. I'm not just going to expose what Richard did. I'm going to make sure Marcus faces consequences for continuing his father's legacy of violence, and I'm going to do it with the full truth, every ugly piece of it, so nothing like this can ever happen to another family again. His phone rang before Constance could respond, Yolanda's name flashing across the screen. Xavier answered immediately, his expression sharpening as he listened. Say that again, he said slowly. Amara watched his face shift from grim determination to something like shock. He did what? Xavier's voice rose sharply. When? A long pause. Then Xavier's eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them, something had settled in his expression. Not relief exactly, but a kind of grim, weary vindication. Understood. Get everyone to the district attorney's office within the hour. I want this documented before he has a chance to spin it. He ended the call and turned to Amara and Constance, exhaling slowly. Marcus just turned himself in, Xavier said, voluntarily, flanked by 3 attorneys, claiming he wants to cooperate fully with an investigation into his father's crimes, positioning himself as a victim of Richard's legacy rather than its architect. A humorless smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He's trying to get ahead of the story before more evidence surfaces. He knows we have enough now to bury him, so he's attempting to control the narrative by appearing to cooperate before we can expose the full extent of what he's done. Will it work? Amara asked. Not if I have anything to say about it, Xavier said, steel returning to his voice. Yolanda's already pulling the security footage from Sterling Diagnostics, the wire transfer records, everything connecting Marcus directly to the fabricated documents and the illegal access into your mother's medical file. Cooperation doesn't erase what he's already done. It just means he's finally scared enough to try controlling how bad the fallout looks. Constance stepped forward, resolve hardening her tear-streaked face. I'm coming with you to the district attorney's office. It's time I gave a full statement, on the record, about everything. My friendship with your mother, what I witnessed, what I helped cover up out of fear. 30 years is long enough to carry this alone. Xavier nodded, gratitude and respect warring with the exhaustion evident in every line of his body. He turned to Amara, taking both her hands in his dark eyes searching her face with a tenderness that cut through even this chaos. This isn't over, he said quietly. Marcus may be cooperating now, but there will be a trial. Reporters, scrutiny into every corner of both our lives. I won't blame you if this is more than you signed up for when you accidentally called me baby in that cafe a week ago. Amara's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice, the quiet fear beneath his words that after everything they'd uncovered and survived together, she might still choose to walk away. Xavier, she said softly, reaching up to cradle his face in her hands. I didn't survive my father's death, my mother's cancer, and years of financial struggle just to run from the first real thing that's ever made me feel alive. Whatever comes next, trials, reporters, scrutiny, I'm not going anywhere. Vanessa believed I was sent to save you from becoming a man who felt nothing. But these past few days, I think you've saved me too. From believing I'd spend my whole life just surviving instead of actually living. Xavier's eyes glistened with emotion as he leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers, the same tender intimacy from the night before returning between them, despite the exhaustion and danger surrounding them. Then let's finish this, he murmured, together. And when it's done, truly done, I want to take you somewhere far away from Atlanta, from boardrooms, from all of it, and just be two people who found each other against every possible odd. I'd like that, Amara whispered, allowing herself for just a moment to imagine a future beyond the chaos currently consuming both their lives. But as they turned to leave the chapel yard, Amara's phone buzzed one final time. A text from the same unknown number that had haunted her for days. Enjoy your victory while it lasts. Marcus was never the real threat. He was just a distraction to keep you both looking in the wrong direction. The person who actually ordered Vanessa's death is still out there, still watching, and still very much in control. You'll understand soon enough. Someone who's been waiting far longer than Marcus Sinclair. Amara's blood ran cold as she stared at the screen, the fragile relief of the last hour shattering into fresh terror. Xavier, she whispered, showing him the message with trembling hands. I don't think this is over. I don't think Marcus was ever really in control of any of this. Xavier read the message twice, his face draining of color as a horrifying realization dawned in his eyes. If Marcus wasn't giving the orders, he said slowly, then someone has been manipulating him this entire time too. Someone patient enough to wait 30 years. Someone who orchestrated my mother's death, Vanessa's death, and everything Marcus has done this week, all without ever showing their face. He looked up at Amara, dread and fierce protectiveness warring in his expression. And whoever they are, he said quietly, they just told us they're still watching. They didn't stay at the chapel a moment longer than necessary. Xavier had Yolanda dispatch 2 additional security details, one to Grady Memorial to watch over Loretta, another to Amara's apartment building, and a third quietly to Constance's home in Buckhead. Whoever sent that message knows things about my family that only a handful of people alive should know, Xavier said as they climbed into the town car, his voice tight with a new, colder kind of fear than anything Marcus had inspired. 30 years of patience. That's not a rival businessman. That's someone with a much longer memory. Could it be someone from your grandfather's generation? Amara asked. Someone who knew about Richard's paternity from the beginning? Possibly. Or someone connected to my mother's family, Xavier said, rubbing his temples. I don't know enough about her life before she married my father. My father made sure of that. He erased her so thoroughly I don't even know where she grew up. Constance, sitting across from them, cleared her throat. Diane grew up in Savannah. Old money, though not nearly as old as the Callaways. Her family lost most of their fortune in the 80s, which is partly why the marriage to your father raised eyebrows at the time. People whispered she'd married up. But there was someone else in her life before your father. A cousin, I believe, Reginald Voss. He was obsessively protective of her. Furious when she chose your father over the life he thought she should have had. I always assumed the anger faded over the years. Perhaps I was wrong. Xavier's eyes sharpened. Is he still alive? Last I heard, he ran a private security and consulting firm. Very quiet, very exclusive clientele. I haven't thought about him in decades. Constance's brow furrowed. Xavier, if Reginald has spent 30 years nursing that kind of resentment, and if he somehow discovered what really happened to Diane, he wouldn't need Marcus's motive for revenge. He'd have his own. Then we find him, Xavier said grimly, already dialing Yolanda. Today, Reginald Voss's firm, Voss Security Consulting, occupied a nondescript office building in Buckhead, the kind of place that didn't advertise, didn't need to, and clearly served clients who valued discretion above all else. Yolanda had pulled his file within the hour. Military background, decades in private intelligence, no criminal record, but an unsettling pattern of contracts with shell companies that traced back, through 4 or 5 layers of obfuscation, to entities connected with both Sinclair Vance Capital and, more troublingly, Callaway Enterprises itself. He's been working both sides, Yolanda said grimly, showing Xavier the financial trail on her tablet as they waited in the car outside the building. Contracts with Richard Sinclair going back 15 years, and smaller, more recent contracts paid through a blind trust, connected to your own company's board discretionary fund. Someone on your board has been paying this man for something, Xavier, and it wasn't authorized through any channel I can identify. Xavier's jaw clenched. Get me the list of everyone with discretionary fund access. Already pulled it. 7 names, yours. Marcus's before tonight. Constance's. Yolanda hesitated. And 4 others, including your CFO Daniel Pruitt. Pruitt's been with the company 20 years, Xavier said, disbelief coloring his voice. He was one of my father's first hires, which means he was there for all of it, Amara said quietly. The embezzlement, your mother's death, everything. Xavier's expression turned to stone. Get him on the phone now. But before Yolanda could dial, the glass doors of Voss Security Consulting opened, and a tall, silver-haired man in an impeccable dark suit stepped out onto the sidewalk, his eyes finding their car immediately as though he'd been expecting them. That's him, Constance whispered. That's Reginald. Xavier didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the car, Amara close behind him despite Yolanda's protest, and crossed the sidewalk to meet the man directly. Reginald Voss, Xavier said, his voice deceptively calm. We need to talk about Diane Calloway. Something flickered behind the older man's eyes, grief, guarded and old, quickly masked by practiced composure. I wondered how long it would take you to find your way to me, Xavier. You have her eyes, you know. I always thought so, even when you were small. You knew her. I loved her, Reginald said simply, no hesitation, no shame. Before your father, before any of this. She chose the Calloway name because she believed it would protect her family's collapsing fortune, and I never forgave myself for not fighting harder for her. When she died, his voice caught, 30 years of grief surfacing in an instant. When she died, and I learned years later what your father and Richard Sinclair truly allowed to happen to her, I made a promise that I would make sure justice came for her, one way or another, no matter how long it took. Was it you? Xavier demanded, some coiled tension in his shoulders finally breaking loose. The messages, the threats. Are you the one who's been manipulating Marcus this entire time? Reginald's expression sharpened with something like offense. I have spent 30 years quietly gathering evidence against Richard Sinclair, and, yes, against your own father's cowardice, Xavier. I have never once threatened Amara. I have never touched her mother's medical records. And I certainly never orchestrated Vanessa's death. I love Diane too much to ever inflict that kind of grief on another family. His eyes hardened. But I do know who did send you that message tonight, because they've been paying me for information about your family for the last 6 months, believing I shared their goal of dismantling the Calloway empire. I only recently realized their goal was never justice, it was simply control. Who? Xavier's voice was low and dangerous. Reginald's gaze shifted, slow and deliberate, past Xavier's shoulder, to the town car where Yolanda sat waiting with the door still open, her tablet glowing in her lap. Daniel Pruitt, Reginald said quietly. Your CFO has been feeding me questions about your mother's death for 6 months, Xavier, always framed as though he wanted justice for Diane. I believed him at first. It was only last week, when he began asking pointed questions about a woman named Amara Whitfield, weeks before you ever met her, that I realized his interest had nothing to do with justice at all. Amara felt the blood drain from her face. He knew about me, before Xavier and I even met. He's known about you for years, it seems, Reginald said grimly. I don't yet understand why. But I intend to find out, and given what I've just learned about the messages you've received, I suspect the answer to that question is the key to everything that's happened this past week. Xavier's phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He answered immediately, his face draining of color as he listened. When? He demanded. Where is he now? A pause. Then Xavier's hand tightened around the phone, hard enough that his knuckles went white. Pruitt's gone, he said, turning to Amara, Constance and Reginald, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. Yolanda's security team went to bring him in for questioning 20 minutes ago. His office is cleared out, files wiped, and according to building security, he left the building 40 minutes ago, with a woman matching Loretta Whitfield's description, getting into his car willingly. Amara's entire world tilted, horror crashing over her in a wave so violent she nearly lost her footing. That's not possible, she whispered, already dialing her mother's phone with trembling hands. My mother's in the hospital, she's undergoing treatment, she wouldn't just leave with a stranger. The call rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Amara's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. Xavier, she said, her voice breaking, my mother's not answering, she's not answering, and Pruitt has her. Xavier was already moving, barking orders into his phone, pulling Amara toward the car with fierce protective urgency. We're going to Grady Memorial right now. Yolanda, pull every camera in a 5-block radius. Reginald, I'll help however I can, Reginald said grimly, already moving toward his own vehicle. Whatever Pruitt is planning, he's had 6 months of my unwitting help gathering information he shouldn't have had access to. I owe you the truth, and I owe Diane's memory the justice I promised her 30 years ago. The drive to the hospital passed in a terrified blur, Amara's mind spinning through nightmare scenarios, her hands clutched tight around Xavier's as he held her against his side, murmuring reassurances neither of them fully believed. They arrived to find Loretta's hospital room empty, the bed neatly made, no sign of struggle, only a single folded note left on the pillow where her head should have been. Xavier snatched it up, his face going ashen as he read the words scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting. "Bring me the original trust documents from Edmund Calloway's estate. The ones proving Richard Sinclair's true paternity and the full extent of what your father knew about Diane's murder. Come alone to the old Sinclair textile warehouse on Peachtree Industrial by midnight. Bring the documents, and Amara's mother walks away unharmed. Involve the police, and you'll be planning 2 funerals instead of 1 this month." DP Pamara read the note over Xavier's shoulder, terror and fury warring violently in her chest. "Why does he want those documents?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What does 30-year-old paternity proof have to do with kidnapping my mother?" Xavier's expression had gone deadly calm. The particular stillness of a man calculating every possible angle of a war he now understood he was fighting on multiple fronts. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I intend to find out tonight." He turned to her, his dark eyes fierce with a promise she felt in her bones. "And I promise you, Amara, whatever Daniel Pruitt wants, whatever role he's played in all of this, he will not walk away with your mother, not while I'm still breathing." Behind them, Constance had gone very pale, staring at the note in Xavier's hand with an expression of dawning, horrified recognition. "DP," she murmured. "Xavier, I don't think that stands for Daniel Pruitt." "What do you mean?" Constance looked up, her eyes wide with a fear 30 years in the making. "Diane's cousin, the one your mother was closest to before she married your father. Before Reginald, before any of it. His name wasn't Voss. That was Reginald's professional alias, taken from his mother's maiden name to protect the family from scandal decades ago." Constance's hands trembled. His real name, the name he was born with, was Daniel Pruitt Voss. "Reginald and Daniel aren't just old family friends, Xavier." Her next words dropped like a stone into still water. "They're brothers." Xavier spun toward Reginald, who had gone rigid, his face carved from the same stone as the gravestones they'd left behind at Ashford Chapel. "Is that true?" Xavier demanded. For a long moment Reginald said nothing, his jaw working as though the truth had been locked behind his teeth for so long it had forgotten how to escape freely. "Daniel is my younger half-brother," he finally admitted, his voice hollow. "Same mother, different fathers. We were raised apart. I stayed with our mother's family. He was sent to live with his father's people after she remarried. We reconnected as adults quietly, and yes, I helped him get his position at Calloway Enterprises 20 years ago. I never imagined," his voice cracked, "I never imagined he'd use that position for anything but honest work." "You've been feeding him information about my family for 6 months," Xavier said, fury and betrayal sharpening every word. "Information he's now using to kidnap Amara's mother." "I didn't know what he intended to do with it," Reginald said desperately. "I swear to you, Xavier, I believed we shared the same goal, exposing Richard Sinclair, finding justice for Diane. I never imagined my own brother had motives I couldn't see." "We don't have time for this," Amara said, her voice shaking but resolute, cutting through the tension crackling between the two men. "My mother is somewhere with a man who's already proven he's dangerous. Every minute we spend arguing about the past is a minute she's in danger." Xavier's eyes snapped to her, and something in his expression steadied instantly, the fury banking into cold, focused resolve. "You're right." He turned to Yolanda, who had arrived moments earlier with 2 additional security personnel. "I need everything on Daniel Pruitt Voss, every property he owns, every alias, every connection, and I need it in the next 20 minutes. Xavier, the note said to come alone." Constance reminded him urgently. "If he sees security, if he sees police—" "I know what the note said." Xavier's voice was granite. "But I'm not walking into a warehouse alone at midnight with the only leverage he wants, without a plan to get Loretta out safely first. We do this smart, not fast." Reginald stepped forward, his expression a mixture of shame and fierce determination. "Let me help. I know Daniel better than anyone alive. I know how he thinks, what he values, where his weaknesses are. Please, Xavier, let me help fix what I unknowingly contributed to." Xavier studied him for a long moment, weighing 30 years of buried family history against the urgent need in front of them. Finally, he nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Talk now, everything you know about your brother." They gathered in the back office of Voss Security Consulting. An hour later, maps of the old Sinclair textile warehouse spread across a conference table, Yolanda's security team cross-referencing satellite imagery with blueprints. Reginald had pulled from decades-old property records. "Daniel's always been driven by resentment," Reginald explained, tracing a finger along the warehouse's exterior perimeter on the blueprint. "Our mother favored me, gave me her maiden name to protect me from scandal, while Daniel grew up feeling discarded, forgotten, raised by a father who resented his existence. When I got him the position at Calloway Enterprises, I thought I was finally giving him something our childhood never provided. Stability, respect, a name that meant something. His jaw tightened. I didn't realize how deeply that resentment had calcified into something far more dangerous. What does he want with the trust documents? Xavier asked. Why does 30-year-old paternity proof matter to him now? Reginald's expression darkened with dawning, horrified understanding. Because if Richard Sinclair was Edmund Calloway's illegitimate son, entitled to half the original Calloway fortune by blood, then anyone descended from Richard has a legal claim to contest the entire company's ownership structure. Marcus would have been the obvious heir to that claim. But if Marcus is removed from power, disgraced, facing criminal charges, then someone else with a blood connection to Richard Sinclair could step forward to claim it instead. Amara finished, horror dawning in her chest. Daniel isn't related to Richard by blood. Why would this benefit him? Constance, who had been quietly studying an old photograph pulled from Voss Securities' files, went suddenly deathly pale. Because he's not trying to claim Richard's inheritance, she said slowly, her voice trembling. He's trying to prove his own. Every head in the room turned toward her. What are you talking about? Xavier demanded. Constance held up the photograph, an old faded image of a young woman Amara didn't immediately recognize, though something about the shape of her eyes tugged at a distant, unsettling familiarity. This is Marguerite Sinclair, Constance said quietly. Richard's mother, the woman your grandfather had an affair with in the 60s. Her hand trembled as she turned the photograph toward the light. I met her once, decades ago, at a Sinclair family gathering your father dragged me to when I was still young in my career. She had a daughter too, born nearly 15 years after Richard, from a much later relationship. I remember because everyone whispered about it. A scandal for a woman already scandalous in that circle's eyes. A daughter, Xavier repeated slowly. Half-sister to Richard Sinclair, Constance confirmed, which would make her, if she had children of her own, another legitimate blood claim to the fortune your grandfather sired outside his marriage. Her eyes lifted to Reginald, dawning horror plain on her face. Reginald, what was your mother's name before she married your father? The color drained entirely from Reginald's face. Marguerite, he whispered. My mother's name was Marguerite Sinclair Voss. The room fell into stunned, horrified silence. You're Richard Sinclair's half-brother, Xavier said slowly, piecing together decades of buried family lies with growing, sickened clarity. Not through your father, through your mother, which means Daniel is also blood related to Richard Sinclair, Reginald finished, his voice hollow with shock, which means, by extension, to your grandfather Edmund Calloway. Legally, if the paternity proof surfaces publicly and this bloodline is confirmed, Daniel could contest ownership of Calloway Enterprises itself, arguing an equal claim to the fortune Richard was denied and Marcus inherited. That's insane, Amara said. Even if that's true, that's decades-old blood ties to a scandal. No court would grant him ownership of an active company based on an affair from 60 years ago. No court needs to, Xavier said grimly, understanding dawning with terrible clarity. He doesn't need to win a legal battle. He just needs enough scandal, enough proof of the family's rot, to force a settlement. A payout large enough to make the entire mess disappear quietly. Companies do it constantly rather than let decades-old scandal play out in open court and tank stock value. His eyes hardened. This was never about justice for my mother, or even genuine resentment toward my family. It's an extortion play 30 years in the making, and Loretta is just the leverage he needs to force my hand tonight. Then we don't give him what he wants, Amara said fiercely. We get my mother out safely, and we expose every single lie he's built this scheme on. Xavier turned to her, something fierce and proud blazing in his dark eyes, despite the terror of the hour. That's exactly the plan. Midnight found them a quarter-mile from the old Sinclair textile warehouse, Yolanda's security team positioned in the surrounding industrial darkness, Xavier's Blacktown car idling at the agreed meeting point with Xavier alone in the driver's seat, exactly as Daniel's note had demanded. Amara sat crouched in the back of a surveillance van 2 blocks away with Constance and Reginald, watching a live feed from the tiny camera hidden in Xavier's lapel, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might crack her ribs. He's approaching the warehouse, Yolanda murmured, monitoring the feed with clinical focus that Amara desperately envied. Everyone stay sharp. Nobody moves until Loretta is confirmed safe. Through the shaky camera feed, Amara watched Xavier step out of the car, a leather folio clutched in one hand. Decades-old trust documents Reginald had helped authenticate that afternoon, real enough to satisfy Daniel's demands, though Xavier's team had already photographed and secured copies of everything before handing over the originals. The warehouse's massive rolling door groaned open as Xavier approached, revealing a cavernous, dimly lit interior stacked with decades-old textile equipment rusting in the shadows. And there, in the center of the open floor, stood Daniel Pruitt Voss, tall, composed, dressed in an impeccable suit that seemed almost obscenely formal against the industrial decay surrounding him. Beside him, in a folding chair, sat Loretta Whitfield, her wrists zip-tied to the chair's arms, her expression more furious than frightened. "You didn't hurt her," Xavier said, his voice carrying clearly through the camera's microphone, tight with barely controlled fury. "I'm not a monster, Xavier," Daniel said smoothly. "I simply needed leverage to ensure you'd take my request seriously. You'll notice she's been given water, a blanket, even a comfortable enough chair given the circumstances. I'm 71 years old and I'm undergoing chemotherapy, you fool." Loretta snapped from her chair, glaring at Daniel with a ferocity that would have made Amara proud in any other circumstance. "Comfortable chair or not, you kidnapped a sick woman from her hospital bed. There's a special place in hell reserved for that." Despite the terror gripping her chest, Amara felt a fierce surge of pride at her mother's unbroken spirit. "Let her go," Xavier said, holding up the folio. "You have what you asked for, the original trust documents. Everything proving Richard Sinclair's paternity and, by extension, your own family's blood connection to Edmund Calloway's estate." Daniel's eyes gleamed with something calculating and hungry as he crossed the warehouse floor to accept the folio, flipping through the documents with practiced efficiency. "You're smarter than I anticipated," he said almost admiringly as he confirmed the document's authenticity. "Most men in your position would have gone straight to the police, tried to be a hero, but you understood the calculation, didn't you? A quiet, sizable settlement is far less costly than a public scandal unraveling everything your family has spent 70 years building." "I understand exactly what you're trying to do," Xavier said coldly. "What I don't understand is why you'd risk everything, kidnapping, extortion, federal charges, when Marcus already handed you a far easier path to destroying my family's reputation without any of this danger." Something flickered across Daniel's composed expression, the first crack Amara had seen since the confrontations began. "Marcus was never going to succeed," Daniel said, a note of contempt entering his voice. "He's a spoiled child playing at corporate warfare with his father's old grudges, too impatient and too visible to execute anything with real precision. I've spent 30 years working in the shadows of your family's empire, watching, waiting, learning exactly how this company functions from the inside. I don't need Marcus's clumsy scandals or his father's decades-old vendetta. I need one clean, quiet transaction, and then I disappear with more money than either Richard or Marcus Sinclair ever managed to steal in 30 years of trying." "How much?" Xavier asked, his voice deceptively calm. $200 million, Daniel said without hesitation. "Wired to an account I'll provide, structured to avoid triggering any regulatory flags, completed within 48 hours. In exchange, I disappear completely. No further contact, no further threats, and these documents," he gestured to the folio, "conveniently lost forever, along with any further public discussion of your mother's murder or your family's uglier history. And if I refuse," Daniel's smile turned cold, "then I release everything to every major news outlet in the country, along with a very compelling account of how Xavier Calloway's family has spent 70 years burying murder, embezzlement, and corporate fraud beneath a veneer of respectability. Your company's stock collapses. Your reputation is destroyed beyond any recovery. And Loretta Whitfield, unfortunately, becomes collateral damage in a kidnapping gone wrong." The threat hung in the cold warehouse air, and through the camera feed, Amara watched Xavier's jaw tighten with barely restrained fury. "You won't touch her," Xavier said, each word carved from ice. "I sincerely hope it doesn't come to that," Daniel said, though his tone carried no real conviction of hope at all. "But I've spent my entire life being underestimated, overlooked, discarded by men who inherited everything I was denied simply by accident of birth. I won't be underestimated again. Not by you, not by anyone. In the surveillance vans," Amara's hands had curled into fists so tight her nails bit into her palms. "We need to move," she whispered urgently to Yolanda. "He's not going to let my mother go peacefully. I can hear it in his voice." "Not yet," Yolanda murmured, her eyes fixed on the tactical display. "My team is in position, but if we move too early, we risk him panicking with a hostage still restrained. We need Xavier to get her unrestrained first, or get physical distance between Daniel and Loretta." On the screen, Xavier seemed to reach the same calculation. "I'll agree to your terms," he said slowly. "But I need proof of good faith first. Untie her, let her walk to the car. Once she's safely away, I'll authorize the transfer myself in front of you, so you can verify it clears before you leave." Daniel studied him for a long moment, suspicion warring with the obvious appeal of finally securing his prize after decades of resentment and planning. Finally he nodded, gesturing to a man Amara hadn't noticed lurking in the warehouse shadows. Another hired accomplice, silent and imposing, who moved to cut the zip ties binding Loretta's wrists. The moment her hands were free, Loretta didn't hesitate. She rose from the chair with more speed than Amara would have believed possible for a woman mid-chemotherapy, and in a single fluid motion, drove her elbow backward into the accomplice's throat, with a precision that suggested decades of raising two daughters alone had taught her more about self-defense than anyone had given her credit for. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Yolanda's team burst through the side entrances the moment the accomplice staggered backward, gasping. Xavier lunged forward, grabbing Loretta and pulling her behind him even as Daniel, understanding immediately that his careful plan had collapsed, reached inside his jacket with frantic, desperate speed. "Gun!" Yolanda shouted through the comm system, and Amara's heart stopped entirely as she watched, helpless, from 2 blocks away, security agents converging on the warehouse floor with weapons drawn. "Don't move!" One of Yolanda's agents shouted, training his weapon on Daniel, who stood frozen in the center of the chaos, a small pistol clutched in his trembling hand, his eyes darting wildly between the surrounding agents and Xavier, who had positioned himself protectively in front of Loretta. "Put it down, Daniel," Xavier said, his voice steady despite the chaos, despite the very real danger of a loaded weapon pointed somewhere in his general direction. "It's over, you have nowhere left to run, and hurting anyone else in this room only guarantees you spend the rest of your life in prison instead of a fraction of it." For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. Daniel's chest heaved with ragged breaths, 30 years of buried resentment and carefully constructed plans collapsing around him in real time, his finger visibly trembling against the trigger. "I just wanted what was mine," Daniel said, his composed mask finally shattering entirely, revealing something raw and broken underneath. "I watched Reginald get everything, the name, the stability, the respect, while I got nothing. I watched Richard Sinclair build an empire from a birthright he was denied, while your family built theirs on the same stolen foundation and called it legacy instead of theft. I just wanted someone to finally acknowledge what was taken from people like me." "Then let this be the moment you get that acknowledgement," Xavier said, his voice softening slightly despite everything, some flicker of genuine compassion breaking through his fury. "Not through violence, not through extortion. Put the gun down, Daniel, and I promise you, whatever grievance you have against this family's history, it will be heard, in court, publicly, on the record. But not like this, not with anyone else getting hurt tonight." Daniel's eyes glistened with tears, decades of resentment finally cracking under the weight of exhaustion and defeat. Slowly, achingly slowly, his trembling hand lowered the weapon, letting it clatter to the concrete floor. Yolanda's agents moved immediately, securing him with practiced efficiency as Daniel sank to his knees, sobbing, not with fear, Amara realized, watching through the shaky camera feed, but with the exhausted release of a man who had spent his entire life fighting a battle he'd never truly been equipped to win. In the surveillance van, Amara finally allowed herself to breathe, tears of relief streaming down her face as Constance gripped her hand tightly, both of them watching Xavier gather Loretta into his arms, holding her steady as security swarmed the warehouse, securing Daniel, calling for medical evaluation, beginning the long process of unraveling 30 years of buried family secrets in the harsh light of legal accountability. "It's over," Constance breathed, disbelief and relief warring in her voice. "After 30 years, it's finally over." But as Amara scrambled out of the surveillance van, running toward the warehouse to reach her mother and the man who had somehow, impossibly, become essential to her life in the span of a single chaotic week, her phone buzzed one final time, a text from an unknown number, not the same one that had haunted her for days, but a new, unfamiliar contact. "Congratulations on surviving Daniel Pruitt-Voss. He was a useful pawn, but a pawn nonetheless. I've been watching this entire operation unfold with great interest, Ms. Whitfield. You should know that everything you believe you've uncovered tonight, Richard Sinclair's paternity, Diane's murder, even Daniel's extortion scheme, was only ever the surface of something far older, far larger, and far more carefully constructed than any of you realize. Enjoy your reunion with Xavier tonight. It may be the last peaceful evening either of you gets for quite some time." The architect. Amara's blood ran cold as she stared at the message, the warehouse chaos around her fading into distant, muffled noise. Whoever had sent this message wasn't Marcus, wasn't Daniel, wasn't even connected, it seemed, to the Sinclair family's 30-year vendetta at all. Someone else, someone calling themselves the architect, had been orchestrating events from the shadows this entire time, watching every devastating revelation unfold like pieces on a chessboard, only they could fully see. And Xavier caught sight of her running toward him, his face breaking into an expression of pure relief and love despite the chaos surrounding them both. Amara realized with growing dread that tonight's victory, however hard won, had only been the opening move in a much longer, much darker game. Xavier reached her in 3 long strides, pulling her into his arms amid the swirling chaos of security agents and emergency responders, his hands trembling as they framed her face, checking for any sign of harm despite the fact that she'd never been in the warehouse at all. "You're shaking," he murmured, and Amara realized her legs had gone weak, adrenaline draining from her body all at once, leaving cold dread in its place. "There's another message," she said, holding up her phone with unsteady hands. "Someone calling themselves the architect. They said Daniel was just a pawn. They said everything we've uncovered tonight was only the surface." Xavier read the message, his jaw tightening with an exhaustion that went bone deep, 36 hours of relentless revelation finally catching up to him all at once. "Not tonight," he said quietly, though his eyes carried the same dread Amara felt curling in her own chest. "Whoever this is, whatever they want, it can wait until morning. Your mother needs medical evaluation, Constance needs rest, and I need—" His voice caught, vulnerability breaking through the exhausted armor he'd worn all day. "I need a few hours where the only thing I'm thinking about is that you're safe, and your mother's safe, and we're all still standing after everything this family's history has cost." Loretta, sitting wrapped in a paramedic's blanket nearby, waved Amara over with an impatient hand despite the exhaustion evident in her face. "Baby, come here, let your mother look at you." Amara crossed to her, kneeling beside the gurney, tears finally spilling freely as she took her mother's hand. "You elbowed a kidnapper in the throat," Amara said, half laughing, half sobbing. "Mama, you're undergoing chemo." "Cancer hasn't taken my elbow yet," Loretta said, managing a tired, fierce smile. "Raised 2 girls alone after your father passed. You think some rich man's henchman was going to be the thing that finally broke me?" Her expression softened as her eyes moved past Amara to where Xavier stood a respectful distance away, giving them privacy despite his obvious need to stay close. "That man loves you, Amara. I watched him walk into that warehouse alone, carrying documents that could destroy his entire family's legacy, because he'd rather risk everything than risk losing you or me. That's not a man chasing some prophecy in a dead woman's journal. That's a man who's already decided." Amara glanced back at Xavier, her heart swelling with an emotion so overwhelming it nearly stole her breath. "I know, Mama. I feel the same way." "Then stop wasting time being scared of it," Loretta said, squeezing her hand. "Lord knows we've all learned this week that time's the one thing none of us can count on." They didn't get the peaceful evening Xavier had hoped for. By the time Loretta was cleared by paramedics and Constance had been safely escorted home under Yolanda's protective detail, the sun was already rising over Atlanta's skyline, painting the city in soft gold that felt almost mockingly serene given the devastation of the previous night. Daniel Pruitt-Voss had been taken into federal custody, charged with kidnapping, extortion, and a growing list of financial crimes that Yolanda's forensic accountants were still untangling. Reginald, shattered by his brother's betrayal but resolute in his desire to make amends, had agreed to cooperate fully with investigators, providing decades of documentation that would ultimately corroborate everything. Constance and Denning had already confessed. Marcus Sinclair, already in custody following his own surrender, now faced an expanding list of charges as prosecutors connected his fabricated medical fraud scheme to Daniel's kidnapping plot. The 2 men, it turned out, had briefly crossed paths 8 months earlier at Richard Sinclair's funeral, each independently plotting to exploit the same buried family secrets for entirely separate purposes, neither fully aware of how their schemes would eventually collide. But the architect remained a ghost. No traceable IP address, no identifiable phone number, no fingerprint anywhere in the digital trail Yolanda's team exhaustively searched. "Whoever sent that message knew things only a handful of people should know," Yolanda said grimly. 3 days later, as she briefed Xavier and Amara in the Callaway Enterprises boardroom, now cleared of any lingering Sinclair influence following Marcus's removal. They referenced Daniel's operation with specific, accurate detail hours before it became public knowledge. That's not guesswork. That's someone with direct access to information only law enforcement and a handful of us in this room possessed. "A leak," Xavier said grimly. "Someone inside the investigation itself, or someone who's been embedded in your family's affairs for far longer than any of us realized," Yolanda said. "I've expanded the investigation to include historical company records going back to your grandfather's era. If the architect has been watching this family for that long, there has to be a paper trail somewhere. Nobody orchestrates something this patient without leaving some trace, eventually." Amara sat quietly through the briefing, her mind circling back to something that had nagged at her since the warehouse, a detail too small to have mattered before Reginald's revelation about his and Daniel's shared bloodline, but now impossible to ignore. "Constance," she said slowly, turning to the older woman, who sat at the far end of the table. "You," said Marguerite Sinclair, "had a daughter, Richard's half-sister, born 15 years after him. Do we know anything about her? What happened to her, whether she had children of her own?" Constance's brow furrowed in thought. "I only met her once, decades ago. I don't recall her name, only that there was scandal surrounding her birth, the same as Richard's. If she had children, I have no record of it." It was never relevant to anything I was investigating regarding Diane's death. But it might be relevant now, Xavier said, understanding dawning in his eyes as he followed Amara's train of thought. If the architect has connections to this family stretching back generations, and if Richard Sinclair had a half-sister nobody's ever accounted for, then there could be an entire branch of this family's bloodline we've never even considered, Amara finished. Someone with just as much claim, just as much motive, and 30 years more patience than either Marcus or Daniel to plan something this elaborate. Yolanda was already typing rapidly on her tablet. I'll pull every genealogical record connected to Marguerite Sinclair. If she had a daughter, there should be a birth certificate, adoption records, something. The search took the better part of a week, complicated by decades of deliberately obscured records, false names, and the kind of careful erasure that suggested someone with resources and foresight had spent considerable effort making sure this particular thread of the family's history remained buried. It was Reginald, ultimately, who finally uncovered the missing piece, a discovery he brought to Xavier's penthouse late one evening, his expression grim with the weight of yet another family secret finally surfacing. Her name was Josephine Sinclair, Reginald said, spreading a thin folder of documents across Xavier's coffee table. Born in 1975, the same year, coincidentally, as my mother's own scandal became public knowledge in certain Atlanta social circles. Josephine was quietly sent to boarding school in Switzerland at 14, ostensibly to avoid further scandal. She never returned to the States permanently, as far as public records show. But 18 years ago she gave birth to a daughter in Geneva. The birth certificate lists no father. Where's the daughter now? Xavier asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Reginald hesitated, his expression carrying a weight that made Amara's stomach clench with sudden dread. She returned to the United States 4 years ago, he said slowly. Enrolled at Emory University under a name that on the surface has no connection to the Sinclair family at all. But when I cross-referenced her academic records with employment history, he pulled one final document from the folder, sliding it across the table toward Xavier and Amara. Amara's breath caught as she read the name typed clearly at the top of the page. A current employee ID issued 18 months ago by Callaway Enterprises Human Resources Department for a junior associate working directly under Constance Whitmore in the company's legal affairs office, Josephine Sinclair Reyes. Position, junior legal associate, direct supervisor, Constance Whitmore. Amara looked up, horror dawning as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into terrible, inescapable place. Constance, she breathed. Someone's been working directly beside you this entire time. Constance, summoned urgently to the penthouse the moment Reginald's discovery came to light, stared at the employee record with an expression of dawning, sickened recognition. Josie, she whispered. Oh God, Josie Reyes. She's been my assistant for the last 8 months. Quiet, brilliant, meticulous. I recommended her for the promotion myself just last week. Her hands trembled as the full weight of the betrayal settled over her. She's had access to every file in my office, every piece of evidence Denning gave us, every detail about Diane's murder, about Vanessa, about everything we've uncovered this past week. Xavier's expression had gone deadly still, 3 decades of buried family history finally converging into a single, horrifying realization. She's not just Richard Sinclair's niece, he said slowly. She's the granddaughter of the woman my grandfather had an affair with. 60 years removed, sitting inside my own company's legal department this entire time, watching every move we've made. His eyes met Amara's, dread and fierce protectiveness warring in his expression. The architect isn't some distant, shadowy figure orchestrating things from afar. He rose from the couch, already reaching for his phone, his voice hardening with grim resolve. She's been in this building the entire time. Xavier's call to building security came back within minutes, and the news it carried settled over the penthouse like a fresh chill. She checked out early today, Yolanda reported, arriving in person 20 minutes later, her expression grim. Told the front desk she had a doctor's appointment. That was 6 hours ago. Her apartment's been cleared out. Landlord says she gave notice 2 days ago. Paid out her lease in full, cash, no forwarding address. She knew we were closing in, Amara said, her mind racing. Or she'd already planned to disappear the moment Daniel's operation collapsed. Both, probably, Constance said, her voice still unsteady with the shock of betrayal. I trained her myself. I taught her how our legal team builds cases, how we track evidence, how we protect sensitive information. If she's been planning this for as long as it seems, she used every skill I gave her to stay 2 steps ahead of us the entire time. Xavier paced the length of his study, his mind visibly working through the tangled architecture of the last week. Marcus's clumsy, visible scheming, Daniel's desperate extortion play, and now, beneath both of them, something far more patient and precise. She let Marcus and Daniel take the fall, he said slowly. She watched both of them make their moves, knowing full well neither one would succeed because neither one actually mattered. They were noise, distraction. While we spent this entire week chasing Marcus's board coup and Daniel's kidnapping plot, she was sitting in Constance's office with unrestricted access to every piece of evidence we were assembling against the Sinclair family's entire criminal history. But why? Amara asked. What does she actually want? If she's not after money like Daniel or power like Marcus, she's after legitimacy, Reginald said quietly, understanding dawning in his weathered face. Think about it. Josephine Sinclair's entire existence has been erased and hidden for 50 years. First her mother, shipped off to Switzerland to avoid scandal, then Josephine herself, raised in secret, brought back to America under an assumed name just to work quietly in the shadows of the very company her family should have partly owned. Marcus wanted Xavier's job. Daniel wanted a payout. Josephine wants something neither of them ever considered. What's that? Xavier asked. Acknowledgement, Reginald said. A public, undeniable, legally binding recognition that she is a legitimate descendant of Edmund Calloway's bloodline, with every right that entails. Not hush money, not a stolen title. The truth, finally forced into the open after 70 years of Calloway secrecy, with her standing at the center of it instead of buried at the margins. The room fell into contemplative silence, the shape of Josephine's motive settling into place with a clarity that felt, somehow, more dangerous than either Marcus's greed or Daniel's desperation. If that's what she wants, Amara said slowly, then she's not finished. Exposing everything we already know wouldn't be enough for her. She needs something bigger. Something undeniable. Xavier's phone buzzed on the table between them, and every head in the room turned toward it with wary tension. He answered on speaker, his voice carefully controlled. Xavier Calloway, hello, cousin. The voice on the other end was calm, cultured, carrying a faint trace of a European accent softened by years of American schooling. Josephine Sinclair Reyes, speaking directly to them for the first time. I imagine Reginald has filled in most of the blanks by now. He was always thorough, even if it took him embarrassingly long to see what his own brother was doing under his nose. Josephine, Xavier said, his voice deceptively even, where's this going? Exactly where it was always going to go, Josephine replied. I watched Marcus flail his father's old grudges around like a blunt instrument. I watched Daniel try to extort his way into a payout he'd have squandered within a decade. Neither of them understood what I understood the moment I discovered my grandmother's history 4 years ago, that money and titles are temporary. Legacy is permanent. And I intend to claim mine, by orchestrating a kidnapping, by manipulating 2 dangerous men into nearly getting people killed. Amara's voice cut in, fury overriding her fear. My mother was tied to a chair last night because of the chaos you helped set in motion. A pause on the line, and when Josephine spoke again, something almost like genuine regret colored her voice. That was regrettable. Daniel exceeded the scope of what I anticipated. I want you to know, Miss Whitfield, that was never part of my design. I've spent 4 years building toward one outcome, and violence was never meant to be part of it. Then what is your design? Xavier demanded. A DNA test, Josephine said simply. Public. Verified by an independent lab, live-streamed if necessary, proving my direct genetic connection to Edmund Calloway through Marguerite Sinclair's bloodline. Alongside it, a formal legal claim, not to your company, Xavier. I have no interest in running Calloway Enterprises, but to a portion of the original family trust my great-grandfather established, the one that should have included Marguerite and her descendants from the very beginning, before your grandfather's cowardice erased her existence. That's it? Xavier asked, disbelief coloring his voice. You could have simply asked, petitioned the estate through legal channels. You didn't need any of this. The manipulation, the fear, the danger to people who had nothing to do with any of it. Could I have? Josephine's voice sharpened with sudden, bitter clarity. Tell me, Xavier, in your 70 years of family history, has a single Calloway ever voluntarily acknowledged a debt owed to someone with less power than themselves? Your grandfather bought silence. Your father inherited that same instinct and let a woman die rather than risk his reputation. Even you, for all your public grief and dramatic press conferences this week, only started asking real questions once the truth was forced into your hands. A beat of silence. I couldn't ask nicely, Xavier, because nobody in your family has ever responded to nice. I had to make the truth impossible to ignore. Amara watched Xavier's face carefully, seeing the words land somewhere deep and uncomfortable. Recognition, perhaps, of an inherited pattern he'd never fully examined until this exact moment. You're not wrong, Xavier said quietly after a long pause. About my family, about the pattern of silence and self-protection that's defined 3 generations before me. He exhaled slowly. But you're wrong that this is the only way. Come forward, publicly, safely, with legal representation instead of extortion. I will personally ensure your claim is heard, verified, and honored if the DNA evidence supports it. Not because I'm forced into it by fear, but because you're right that it should have happened decades ago." A long silence stretched over the line. "You expect me to simply trust you," Josephine finally said, though something in her voice had softened almost imperceptibly. "After everything your family has done to avoid exactly this kind of reckoning." "I don't expect you to trust me blindly," Xavier said. "I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove I'm not my father or my grandfather. Meet with me, in public with lawyers, with press if you want them there as witnesses. Let's end this the way it should have ended generations ago, with the truth acknowledged openly instead of buried or weaponized." Another long pause. When Josephine finally spoke again, her voice carried a note of cautious, weary hope that made Amara's chest ache with unexpected sympathy for a woman who had spent her entire life fighting for something that should have simply been given. "Tomorrow," Josephine said. "Noon. The steps of the Fulton County Courthouse, public enough that neither of us can manipulate the outcome behind closed doors." A pause. "And Xavier, bring Amara. Vanessa's journal wasn't wrong about her, whatever else has gone wrong this week. I've read enough of your family's history to recognize when something rare has actually found its way into it." The line went dead before Xavier could respond, leaving the room in stunned, contemplative silence. Amara turned to him slowly, questions and cautious hope warring in her chest. "Do you believe her? That this ends tomorrow, cleanly, without more danger?" Xavier's expression was solemn, exhaustion and hard-won wisdom mingling in his dark eyes. "I believe she's telling the truth about what she wants. Whether tomorrow goes cleanly depends on how much of my family's old instinct for self-protection I'm able to finally, actually let go of." He reached for Amara's hand, threading their fingers together with a tenderness that had become as essential to her as breathing over this impossible week. "Vanessa's journal said you'd save my life. I think what she actually meant was that you'd help me learn how to stop being the man my family raised me to be and start becoming someone worth saving in the first place." Amara's eyes filled with tears, the weight of everything they'd survived together finally settling into something that felt, for the first time in days, like it might actually resolve into peace. "Tomorrow," she said softly. "Let's go finish this, together." The morning of the courthouse meeting dawned clear and impossibly blue over Atlanta, the kind of pristine autumn sky that felt almost deliberately mocking against the gravity of what waited ahead. Amara stood in front of her closet for 20 minutes before Xavier's driver arrived, unable to decide what a person wore to witness the resolution of a 70-year family conspiracy. She settled, finally, on simple elegance, a deep green dress Denise had helped her pick out 2 days earlier during a rare, much-needed break from the chaos, the two of them sitting in a quiet boutique while Amara tried, haltingly, to explain the surreal avalanche her life had become. "Let me get this straight," Denise had said, holding up a third dress for consideration, her eyebrows raised in disbelief. "You called your boss baby by accident. Now you're dating a billionaire. You almost turned out to be his secret sister. His fiancée died because of a decades-old inheritance conspiracy, and tomorrow you're going to a courthouse to watch a woman who kidnapped your mother's kidnapper's brother's family finally get some inheritance justice." "When you say it like that, it sounds insane," Amara had admitted. "Baby, it sounds like a movie," Denise said, though her teasing tone had softened into something more serious. "Are you okay, really okay? Not just powering through because that's what you always do?" Amara had considered the question honestly, perhaps for the first time all week. "I'm terrified," she admitted, "but I'm also happier than I've been in years. Is that insane?" "No," Denise said gently, squeezing her hand. "That's what it feels like when something real finally shows up in your life after years of just surviving. Terrifying and wonderful at the same time." Now standing outside the Fulton County Courthouse in the crisp autumn air, Xavier's hand steady in hers, Amara understood exactly what Denise had meant. Josephine Sinclair Reyes was already waiting on the courthouse steps when they arrived, flanked by a single sharp-eyed attorney and notably no press. A small mercy Amara hadn't expected given the woman's earlier ultimatum. She looked younger in person than Amara had imagined, mid-20s at most, with striking features that carried unmistakable echoes of the Sinclair bloodline in the sharp cheekbones and dark, watchful eyes. "You came," Josephine said, something like surprised relief flickering across her composed expression. "I said I would," Xavier replied simply. Josephine's attorney stepped forward, presenting a folder to Xavier's legal team, who had arrived separately and now flanked them with quiet, professional efficiency. Independent lab results, gathered discreetly over the preceding 24 hours, verified by 3 separate genetic testing companies with no connection to either family. The results confirmed everything Josephine had claimed. A direct genetic link to Edmund Calloway's bloodline through Marguerite Sinclair, undeniable, thoroughly documented, impossible to dispute. Xavier studied the results for a long moment, then looked up at Josephine with an expression that held none of the wariness Amara had expected, only a kind of weary, generational sadness. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Not for anything I did. For everything that was done to your family, generation after generation, by men who valued reputation over honesty and left people like you to grow up erased, hidden, denied even the truth of your own history." Something in Josephine's carefully controlled composure finally cracked, decades of inherited grief surfacing in her dark eyes. "Nobody in your family has ever said that to me before. Not even in imagination. Then let it be the last time it needs saying, like an apology instead of simply a fact everyone already knows," Xavier said. He turned to his legal team, nodding once. "I've instructed my attorneys to draft an amendment to my grandfather's original trust structure, recognizing Marguerite Sinclair's direct descendants as legitimate beneficiaries, with a settlement calculated fairly against 70 years of compounding interest and inflation, not as extortion, not as damage control, as long overdue justice freely given." Josephine's eyes filled with tears she visibly fought to control. Decades of fighting for legitimacy finally, unexpectedly, met with acknowledgement instead of resistance. "Why? You could have fought this in court for years, buried me in litigation the way your family has buried every inconvenient truth for generations. Because I spent this past week learning exactly how much damage that kind of cowardice costs," Xavier said, his voice thick with the weight of everything he'd uncovered. His mother's murder, Vanessa's death, 3 generations of silence and self-protection. My mother died because my father chose reputation over her life. Vanessa died because that same instinct passed down another generation. I don't intend to be the 3rd generation of Callaway men who let cowardice cost someone everything." His hand found Amara's, grounding himself in her presence even as he spoke. "You deserve the truth openly acknowledged, not because the law forces me to give it, but because it's simply, finally right." For a long moment, Josephine said nothing, visibly struggling against tears that seemed, Amara realized, less about triumph and more about the sheer disorientation of finally receiving something she'd spent her entire life being denied. "I owe you an apology too," Josephine finally said, turning to Amara directly, "for the fear I put you through, for the danger Daniel's involvement created for your mother, even though it was never my intention for things to escalate that far. I was so focused on forcing acknowledgement from this family, I didn't consider carefully enough who might get hurt along the way. Your mother's the granddaughter of a woman erased for love," Amara said quietly, surprising herself with the compassion that surfaced despite everything. "I understand, more than you might realize, what it feels like to grow up not fully knowing your own story. I hope whatever comes next gives you the chance to finally write it on your own terms." Josephine's composure finally broke fully, tears spilling freely down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak for a long moment. "Thank you," she finally managed, "both of you, for choosing something different than what your family's history seemed to guarantee." The settlement negotiations that followed took weeks, rather than the years Josephine had feared, Xavier's genuine commitment to transparency smoothing a process that could easily have devolved into exactly the kind of protracted legal warfare his family had specialized in for generations. Marcus Sinclair's trial proceeded separately, the mounting evidence of fraud, illegal medical record access, and his father's role in 2 murders resulting in a plea deal that would keep him incarcerated for the better part of 2 decades. Daniel Pruitt-Voss received a similarly lengthy sentence, his kidnapping and extortion charges compounded by federal financial crimes uncovered during the ensuing investigation. Reginald, despite his unwitting role in his brother's scheme, cooperated so thoroughly with investigators that prosecutors declined to pursue charges against him, though the guilt of decades spent unknowingly aiding his brother's ambitions would clearly linger far longer than any legal consequence might have. Constance retired from Callaway Enterprises board 3 months later, her decades of service concluding not in scandal as she'd feared, but in quiet, well-earned peace, finally free of 30 years of secrets she'd carried alone. And Amara's mother, Loretta, completed her final round of chemotherapy on a bright December morning, ringing the small brass bell in Grady Memorial's oncology ward surrounded by her daughters, Xavier standing quietly at the back of the small crowd with tears he made no effort to hide. 6 months after Amara had accidentally called a billionaire baby in a crowded executive lounge, she stood on the same rooftop terrace where Xavier had first brought her to explain Vanessa's impossible journal entry, watching the Atlanta skyline glow gold with early evening light. "You know," Xavier said, coming up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist as she leaned back into his familiar warmth, "I used to hate this view. It reminded me of everything I'd lost. Vanessa loved sunsets from up here. Do you still hate it?" Amara asked softly. "No," Xavier said, pressing a soft kiss against her temple. "Now it just reminds me of everything I found because I was finally brave enough to stop running from what I'd lost." He turned her gently in his arms, his dark eyes serious and warm all at once. Amara Whitfield, I've spent 6 months watching you rebuild not just my faith in this family's legacy, but my faith in my own capacity to actually feel something again after 3 years of believing I'd buried that part of myself forever. Amara's breath caught as he lowered himself, slowly, deliberately onto one knee, producing a small velvet box from his jacket pocket with hands that trembled, just slightly, despite 6 months of steady, hard-won courage. I don't need a dead woman's journal to tell me you're the person I'm meant to spend my life with, Xavier said, his voice thick with emotion. I've known that for myself, with absolute certainty, for months now. Marry me, not because fate decided it, because I've chosen it freely with my whole heart, and I intend to keep choosing it every single day for the rest of our lives. Tears streamed down Amara's face as she looked down at him. This man who had walked into a warehouse alone to save her mother, who had chosen truth over generations of family cowardice, who had taught her that surviving and truly living were not the same thing at all. Yes, she whispered, pulling him up into her arms before he could even finish sliding the ring onto her trembling finger. Yes, Xavier, 1,000 times yes. As the Atlanta sunset blazed gold and crimson across the sky behind them, Xavier Calloway kissed the woman who had walked into his life on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, armed with nothing more than an accidental slip of the tongue and a heart brave enough to love a man everyone else had given up on ever thawing. Somewhere, Amara liked to believe, Vanessa was smiling. Thank you, Proudly family, for joining us on this unforgettable journey. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, subscribe to Proudly Black Stories, and don't forget to tell us, which country are you watching from, and what time is it in your city? We'll see you in the next inspiring story.